marvelous long reads.
Marvel's iconic vampire hunter has a prolific life full of tumultuous turmoils and seemingly undefeatable foes. Marked by vampires from birth, Blade had his destiny already laid out for him before he had even taken his first breath in this new world. Blade would go on to embrace that destiny, and his determination would allow him to become the feared Daywalker. From Dracula to ancient Eldritch gods, Blade would stand his ground in front of undefeatable foes and form unlikely allies during his battle. So if you've been wondering about Blade's origin and what the Daywalker is up to in 2026, we have the perfect video for you. Blade's early life and life up till World War II. The year was 1929, and Eric Brooks, aka Blade, was born on the 24th of October in the same year. The conditions of his birth, however, were marked with peril. Lucas Cross, his father, was a member of the secret society named the Order of Tirana. He sent his pregnant wife, Tara, to London, England, when he was about to be captured in Latveria. He gave her specific instructions to find the brothel owner and fellow order member, Madame Vanity. When Tara was there, she adopted the last name Brooks and stayed in hiding to protect herself and her unborn son. Then, however, on the night of his birth, complications arose. Tara and Madame Vanity had hoped that the birth would go quietly at the brothel, but when Blade was born, the umbilical cord was wrapped around his neck and he wasn't breathing. Delirious, his mother began to call out to his father. She demanded Lucas to be by her side, and Madame Vanity was forced to remind her that her boy needed a doctor, not a father. This is when one of the girls walked in with a pale white man who claimed to be a doctor. This was especially lucky, as finding a doctor in the middle of the night in early 1900s London wasn't exactly a small feat. But this was when the man revealed his true perverse nature. Long had he waited for a feast like this, a mother and her newborn, ready and vulnerable for the calling. He then joked that he isn't really a doctor, but is here to end Tara's pain. And this is when Madame Vanity realizes that the man is a vampire. But before she can stop him, the man slaps her across the face and knocks her out. It's rude to interrupt a man's dinner. He then warned them that if they tried anything, they would meet the same fate as Tara and her son, who meanwhile still wasn't breathing. Blade's first look at the world was one of its horrors. He had stared onto the horrors of the world he was born into with vacant and dead eyes. This man was Deacon Frost, and he was the one who killed Blade's mother and infected him while he was still dead. The enzymes entering Blade's body reacted with it differently, and Blade became a human-vampire hybrid with unique powers that allowed him to survive in daylight and become immune to vampire bites. This, however, resulted in Blade growing up with an exceptional hatred for vampires. During his initial years, Madame Vanity treated him as her own. She fed him her own blood to keep his urges satiated, but then eventually came the day when Blade learned the truth the hard way. One of Madame Vanity's girls was trying to make her see the bigger picture. How long was Madame going to keep giving Blade her own blood under the guise of medicine? She couldn't keep the truth from him for much longer, but Madame wanted to be on the safe side. She had taught Blade that mirrors are bad luck, that they can steal your soul. She had stopped cooking with garlic just to be safe, all in an attempt to keep Blade's innocence intact for as long as possible. Isn't that a mother's first job? Even if the one in question is an adoptive mother? The woman talking to Madame Vanity tried to reason with her. Soon Blade wouldn't be able to control his urges as he grew, and a time would come when Vanity wouldn't be able to feed him from her own body, and he was eventually going to learn the truth. Little did they know that day was today, for little Blade had heard everything while peeking in through the door. Madame Vanity and her girls became Blade's family. The brothel became his home, and he accepted the harsh truth that his mother used to work for Madame Vanity. A few years later, on a fated afternoon, Blade and Madame Vanity were returning from their visit to the library, something Blade loved, when the two of them spotted a man getting attacked by two vampires. Madame Vanity was horrified by the sight, and upon hearing her scream, the mysterious man screamed at her to run away. The man seemed to be able to hold his own against the vampires, and when Madame Vanity grabbed Blade to run, she realized that the young man had other plans, for that is the day Blade drew the line. He's done running. He will not run anymore, especially from vampire, the kind responsible for his mother's death. Eric barged in carelessly and began punching one of the vampire's legs with little to no strength. The mysterious man then broke his cane into two pieces and told Eric, "You're a brave lad, I'll give you that, though the line between bravery and stupidity is blurry indeed." The man then plunged the two jagged and sharp pieces of wood through each of the vampire's hearts and ended their lives. And for the first time, Eric was impressed, amazed, and inspired by someone. This man was Jamal Afari, a jazz trumpeter and a mortal enemy to vampires, a man who would go on to teach Eric how to kill vampires and hone his skills. He was Blade's first teacher, and Jamal's first lesson to young Eric was an important one. He got down on one knee, stared directly into Eric's eyes, and told him, "If you are to hunt them, the first lesson is to know them, to be able to identify them on sight. The first way is to look for what isn't there. The vampires have no souls, and those who have no soul cast no reflection." This statement, however, was a double-edged sword for young Eric, for he now understood why he wasn't able to see his own reflection in any mirror. Who was going to hold up a mirror to him? Blade would go on to learn that his kind had a name among vampires, a Dhampir, and upon learning of Eric's plight, Jamal Afari began training him in music, the art of slaying vampires, and how to control his powers and urges. Blade then began hunting low vampires during his teenage years, and he was quite remarkable at it. He used sharp wooden daggers as his primary weapon initially, which earned him the name Blade the Vampire Slayer. The first event that broke Blade happened when he was still young and accidentally killed a human man. Madame Vanity and Jamal were forced to send him to New York, where he joined a Tirana gang called the Blood Shadows. Their leader was Chen Cutter, and Blade would go on to take over the gang by killing Cutter in a knife fight, which was prompted when Blade disapproved of Chen's leadership. Cutter's girlfriend, Glory Anna, would go on to become Blade's first lover, and Blade would take the Blood Shadows back to London, where the group would hunt vampires, demons, and warlocks for months. But then, just when Blade was getting cocky, they found themselves face to face with Lamia, a much older and much more powerful vampire who proved to be quite formidable. Blade eventually managed to drive a stake through Lamia's heart and kill her, but the damage was done. All of the Blood Shadows had been slain, and Glory had been bitten. Glory would go on to become a formidable vampire herself, but subsequently she would refuse to kill Blade. But this mercy came with a warning that Blade would never try to look for her again. And that is when Blade decided to focus on his mission rather than personal relationships. But then tragedy struck once again as things came to an abrupt end for Jamal, as Blade would go on to explain his mentor's fate to Scotland Yard psychic Kate Fraser while they were on the run from the Legion of the Damned, after Blade was framed for the death of a 12-year-old girl by Anton Vierken. Turns out Jamal was a recovering addict when he met Blade for the first time. Seeing the boy's determination inspired him to get sober and move into the brothel to train him and become a father figure to him, a father Blade never had. Then Jamal vanished out of nowhere one day. Vanished for a week, and when he returned, Blade found him cowering under one of the tables at Slow Boys. Blade feared the worst. He feared that Jamal may have relapsed, but it was way worse. Jamal had been turned. Turned out Jamal wasn't lying when he told a young Eric that he had fought and killed Dracula once, for now that Dracula had resurrected, he had come back and exacted revenge on Jamal. Jamal angrily warned Blade to stay away, but he simply couldn't abandon his mentor, and despite Jamal's best efforts, he ended up attacking Blade. Blade had no choice but to fight back and end his mentor's life using a pair of silver candlesticks from the restaurant. And thus the vampires had come to take from Blade again. Deacon Frost took his mother, Dracula took his adoptive father. Before he could hunt down Dracula, Blade joined a group led by Soldier Supreme named the Secret Invaders to fight in World War II. So in 1943, the Secret Invaders went on a mission on the Irish Sea, but got held up after the Nazis sent the vampire Luftwaffe to delay them. Soldier Supreme, aka Sebastian Sardos, was the only one who managed to make it to the island, where he fought off Mephisto, who forced him to kill all of his men after possessing them one by one. Then the Nazis arrived, and Mephisto took over them as well, but aid from the Avengers and an albeit late arrival of the Secret Invaders helped save the day. The initial hunt for Dracula and the final form of Blade. Now it was time for revenge and a hunt for Dracula that would take Blade across the world. His first destination was China, where he would go on to join forces with Orji Jones's group, which consisted of Musenda, Olgun Strong, and Azu Umdaman. This group of vampires hunters hatched a plan to take down Dracula all by themselves. Eric had made a name for himself by now, and the group had accepted him and began calling him Blade for his proficiency with all kinds of of sharp objects. The rest of them waited in a dark cave, and Blade took off to be Dracula. Blade may have been famous, but he wasn't famous enough for Dracula to know who he was, and so when the two met, Blade deceived him by making an enticing offer. He told Dracula that he represented a group of men who had done the calculations and firmly believed that vampires would rule the world in the next 60 years, which is why they wanted to begin serving their superior lords right now. In fact, Blade and the group could help Dracula speed up the 60-year process and get it done in only 10 by working for him during the day when the vampires couldn't scheme and hunt. Intrigued and curious, Dracula decided to go along with Blade, and the vampire hunter led him into the cave where his friends were waiting for him. As soon as they entered, Blade turned around and stabbed Dracula in the heart. Despite that, Dracula was too strong for him even in his last moments. He slapped Blade away and thus prompted Ogun to lunge at Dracula and grapple him. He then borrowed one of Orgy's wooden knives and stabbed Dracula again. Believing that Dracula had perished, all of them left, but once they were gone, a dying Dracula was found by his servant, Kuai Hua, and her handmaidens. They answered his final commands, resurrected him, and then Dracula waited for them in the cave for the group to return. That night, 2 of them were killed. Only Musenda and Blade made it out alive, and that too because Dracula showed mercy, so that Blade would be forced to return the favor one day. Musenda decided to retire from vampire hunting after this, and to honor his fallen friends, Eric decided to use the name Blade in honor of them. He also incorporated elements from each man's arsenal into his own equipment. He also took to wearing his mentor's iconic shades, which finally completed his look as the legendary and infamous vampire hunter. Joining the Mighty Avengers. Blade's next appearance was in New York City on 7th November 1972, when he ended up becoming a part of the first Mighty Avengers. Joining him were James Lucas, Luke Cage's father, Constance Molina, a prolific reporter of the time, Adam Brashear, better known as Blue Marvel, and Kalu, a 500-year-old dark magician practitioner from Kamar Taj, which is now in Tibet. But this collaboration didn't start off this way. Instead, it started when Detective James Lucas found himself dumbfounded by the sight of a dead, bat-like creature in a random back alley. The creature's ribcage was torn open, and this is when the world of the supernatural began to unravel for him. Moments later, he was joined by Molina, who had come here for the next breaking story. James at first refused to let her be a part of his crime scene, but when she promised to put him in touch with a guy who knows all about weird sciencey stuff, James couldn't help but take her help. This creature, this case, it was out of his realm, and so he got in his car with Molina and drove off while leaving his partner to take the body back to the morgue. Little did they know that the death of this creature had attracted Blade's attention, who had assumed that this might be some kind of hybrid vampire. And so, as they took the body back to the morgue, Blade jumped on top of the ambulance and hitched a ride. As for James, well, he was put in touch with Adam Brashear, who couldn't say no to him after learning that the story about the dead bat creature in the city was actually real. His wife, however, was quite pissed, for her husband was once again going on an adventure with Molina, who had almost gotten their newborn and Adam killed not too long ago. Meanwhile, at the morgue, the doctor and his assistant are about to begin the dreaded autopsy when suddenly Kalu appears and hypnotizes them. He orders them to leave and then begins to investigate the creature's body. Kalu learns that this is a were-servant created through dark magic, much like the one he uses, and he can't allow that to happen. But then he notices that the fusion between man and beast is too crude, the work of self-taught amateurs. The beast isn't useful as a servant, which means that it was created for sacrifice. But just when Kalu is about to concentrate more, suddenly he is stabbed through the torso by Blade. Blade reveals that he thinks Kalu is a vampire because first, he can turn into mist, second, he can hypnotize, and thirdly, he's dressed like Liberace's Satan-worshipping cousin. Kalu has a healing factor, and so he heals quickly, and though it will take a few decades for him to achieve the pinnacle of his power again, he is more than capable of beating Blade in hand-to-hand combat. The two begin fighting and trade blow after blow, their skills evenly matched, when suddenly the fight is stopped by Detective Lucas, and surprisingly, Molina, who has a .38 revolver of her own, unlicensed of course, something Lucas makes sure to bring up later. Knull threatens the officers, and this is when Blue Marvel calls his bluff, points his finger at him, and sends him flying into the wall with a single blast of antimatter energy. Detective Lucas is shocked to his core when he realizes that Adam is Blue Marvel. He was supposed to have died in space 10 years ago, and this is when Blue Marvel reveals that he decided to retire. But Lucas doesn't understand the man. He could be helping thousands of people around the world every day, and all Adam can tell him is that life can be complicated, and that it can be hard to understand for someone like Lucas, who is just 26 years old. And so, while Knull fixes his nose and comes to terms with the fact that he is among allies, he tells them about the creature, how it is a werebeast created by someone for the sole purpose of sacrifice. This is when Lucas asks the real question: who would murder such a creature and leave it in the street? And then suddenly the bear appears and claims responsibility. She tells them that she killed the creature in self-defense because if the Deathwalkers would have managed to sacrifice the creature, it would have brought about the end of humanity, and the bear can't have that because she enjoys humanity, especially the one that's hers. And then she tells them that she is back here at the morgue because now that she thinks about it, this creature was likely a decoy meant to distract her. And this raises tons of questions, and they all fire them at the bear. She smiles, asks them to sit down, and then begins to explain things to everyone. There was a time before time when the world was ruled by four: Adur of the east, Cairn of the north, Lichidus of the west, and Visidia of the south. These rulers were ruthless, and the only common thing among them was the desire and need for absolute power. They already had absolute power over their people, but for rulers like these, that's never enough. So they began doing the unthinkable to gain more power, crafting rituals before there were rituals, and they started off by human sacrifice. They continued their experiments with the forbidden arts. They tried everything: crushing bodies, draining spirits, drawing in blood. They fed off their own people, used them as fuel, as a resource to gain the darkest of powers. And then came a time when they had destroyed, murdered, and butchered every last human within their reach, but even then, the lust for power ruled them. But where does one go when you can command the elements? What does one do when you're immortal, when you're unstoppable, when you take up the name Deathwalkers? They continued seeking more power in the future, something they're doing to this day. Blade asks if these Deathwalkers have any weakness, and the bear tells them about their aversion to light. They hate sunlight, and even moonlight can be an irritant for them, which means they're likely hiding somewhere underground in the city. Knull analyzes the dead bat creature again, and with all the information at his disposal, he quickly realizes that the bear is another such creature created by these Deathwalkers, who was meant to be sacrificed. But then the bear smiles and chides Knull for assuming things. She is not like the others. She is their first creation, and the Deathwalkers slipped up when creating her. She was created in Tunguska. The year was 1908. Back then, the four of them had found a talisman that they had been searching for years. A talisman that would allow them to end humanity and gain infinite power. And this is when they created a were-creature, their first hybrid, a mix of a bear and a man. But it was their first attempt, and so they put all their power into this ritual. It was too much power, too much magic. It caused the infamous blast of Tunguska, and shockwaves from the blast were felt as far as London. And so when the bear was created, she had too much of everything: too much of the beast, the primal violence of nature, and too much of humanity, too much freedom. And in her first moment of awareness, the bear swore to herself that nobody was ever going to take this freedom away from her. The Deathwalkers survived, of course, and decades later, when the stars were aligned for the ritual again, they tried to ambush her. But the bear escaped them easily because by then she had become morbidly fascinated by explosives. They would send a were-creature after her next, a decade or two later, but she would dispatch it too. But that's the thing about Deathwalkers, they don't stop. And so when they decided they would move on from her, the bear began hunting down the sacrifices they would create to prevent them from ending humanity. She then tells them that they still have the talisman of Kamartaj, and this is when Knull puts two and two together, which fills him with rage. So these were those amateur magicians who desecrated the graves of his people to grab the talisman. Knull swears to exact vengeance, and so he uses his magic to grab the Deathwalker's signature from the dead bat creature so that he can track them. This is when Molina coined the term Mighty Avengers as a joke, but the term stuck despite them all finding it funny. There used to be a secret subway station below City Hall, which was sealed off back in '45. That is the location the Deathwalkers had chosen for their ritual, which they were performing right now with a werewolf creature creature as the focus of it. But just as one of them raised a sword to sacrifice the creature, Blue Marvel burst in through the wall, and he narrowly avoided the flaming sword that was swung at him. Sadly, the sword caught Kalu directly in the chest, and then Visidia of the south used her powers to force the air out of Kalu's lungs. Adam hit her with a blast of antimatter energy to buy them some time, and though Melina was busy firing at the Deathwalkers, Lucas found himself choking. Melina screamed at him to snap out of it, while Blade hit Adur and Cairn with his daggers. Blue Marvel was busy fighting off the werewolf, who was quite strong, and this is when the bear decided to lend a hand. She transformed and then butchered the creature with such precision and ruthlessness that it sent chills down the spine of every man and woman in the room. And this is when Lycidas revealed his hand and used his powers. He began to speak to and control the water in their bodies, and everyone found themselves unable to move a muscle. Lycidas began to gloat and enjoy the satisfaction of having everyone at their mercy, but little did he know that Blue Marvel could manipulate photons, and so a second later he is blasted into oblivion by Blue Marvel. Blade grabbed the talisman of Kamar Taj, and all of them made their escape while Blue Marvel stayed behind to bring down the walls on the Deathwalkers. He caught up to them a couple hours later after having searched for bodies, but sadly he found none. The Deathwalkers had managed to escape. The hunt for vengeance again. It wasn't long before Dracula resurfaced. This time he was fished out of the water at night in Liverpool. The men who fished him out didn't know what to do with him. The doctor was unavailable, and so the only place to take him was the church. There, Father William struggled to identify the evil that had permeated his abode. But before he could put his finger on it, Dracula awoke and fled as soon as he saw all the crosses around him. However, he wasn't strong enough to break through the holy glass, and so he ended up being offered help by a young couple, Dave and Andrea. This is when we find out how Dracula ended up in the water. He was still recovering from a blood transfusion, which made it quite difficult for him to hunt. Eventually, Dracula found himself powerless and fainting in a littered alley, and when he awoke next, a couple of bikers were going through his pockets. Dracula tried to fight back, which resulted in the men grabbing him and throwing him into the water. Then Dracula ended up making friends with Dave and Andrea, and when the town came hunting for him, Dave helped him escape. Dracula may have been undead, but he wasn't ungrateful. He promised to return the favor someday, a favor that might come soon because vampire hunters Quincy Harker, Rachel Van Helsing, and Frank Drake have been searching for him for a long time. They have just been informed that Blade is in town, and by the time they catch up to him, he has already taken out 3 vampires, one of whom was a teenager. Harker chides Blade for his careless slaughter, for these were men from Dracula's legion, and by slaughtering them, Blade has cost Harker and his team weeks worth of preparation. If he hadn't killed these men, they would have led him to Dracula. Blade mocks Harker for thinking that he can kill Dracula, but this is when Harker declares that his organization is more than prepared to kill the king of the undead. He is here with his daughter Edith Harker, and Blade tells Harker to take a hike politely so as not to offend him in front of his daughter before taking off. Once he has left, Harker can't help but point out the good in Blade. He may be crude, but he gets the job done, and so he can't help but wish to join forces with him one day to save the world from the curse of the undead. And Blade would come to regret his decision, for he is going to try and take on Dracula on his own once again and fail. You see, Dracula wants to rule the world. He wants to spread the word and allure of the undead across the world, which is why he is aboard a cruise liner owned by billionaire Gabriel Trulane. The cruise liner is full of influential people from around the world, a Saudi king, hundreds of models, millionaires by the dime, actors relevant or not, they're all here to sell their morals and debauchery. And this is when Gabriel shoves off the girl coming onto him and addresses the entire party and introduces them to Dracula. The guests are ecstatic. They ask him various questions, and Drake skirts all of them skillfully, while also making sure that Gabriel's companion, the girl coming onto him, knows that he is interested in her. Dracula is joined by Clifford Graves, who is put in charge of keeping an eye on the girl once she has been bitten by Dracula. Dracula then hypnotizes the captain of the cruise liner and then holds everyone hostage. The people try to attack him. One actor tries to shoot him, but they soon learn that they are no match for the Lord of the Undead. Dracula gives them an ultimatum: join him and and propagate his cause using their influence, or die here tonight. Little does he know that Blade has boarded the cruise liner. One of the men pulls out a cross, which subdues Dracula momentarily, and this is when the crowd jumps him and tries to drive a stake through his heart. Graves can hear his master struggling, but he can't disobey Dracula's absolute orders to look over the woman. However, this is when she wakes up, knocks him out by hitting him on the head with a lamp, and then goes to find Dracula, whom she believes to be her one true love. Dracula, meanwhile, evades the crowd, fights off Blade, only to then be interrupted by the girl before he can bite him. Blade tries to stab Dracula, but he transforms into a bat and reveals that the hypnotized captain has rigged the cruise liner to blow up. Dracula flies away, and Blade manages to save everyone on board in the nick of time before the cruise liner blows up. The next attack happens on the mainland. Dracula tries to attack a woman named Elizabeth Langley when he is interrupted by Harker, Frank Drake, Edith, Rachel Van Helsing, and Taj Natal. This is Harker's organization, and they manage to save Elizabeth easily. Dracula tries to escape, but Taj grapples him and refuses to let go. They plummet toward the ground, and Dracula uses Taj to break his fall. He then kidnaps Edith, and when Frank tries to intervene, he swats his descendant away like a fly and flies off with Edith. Before leaving, he commands Harker to answer his call in the morning if he wants to save his daughter. And so the next night, Harker and the others are invited to a remote castle where Dracula already has a game planned for them. But little do they know that Blade is also going to be a part of this game. Blade is busy enjoying a romantic night with his love, Saffron Calder, when an abrupt call from Dracula muddies their mood. The King of the Undead taunts Blade and coaxes him into a confrontation, and Blade is too proud to back off from it. And thus the games begin, and Dracula reveals himself by blinding Harker and his vampire hunters. He then cuts out all the lights, which forces Harker to pull out his lighter while Taj lights a torch. Frank gets stuck in one of the broken floorboards, and this is when hundreds of bats begin attacking Rachel. Taj saves her, but by then the damage is done. Her pretty face has been scarred, and though Harker manages to capture a few dozen of them in his net, there's only so much he can do. Dracula taunts them and then hides in the mansion, which forces Frank and Taj to go after him, while Harker remains behind to protect Rachel. Frank and Taj eventually split up to cover more ground, and this is when Blade scares Frank and reveals himself. This is when Dracula unleashes a couple of Black Widows to attack Frank, while Taj is the one who hits the treasure when he manages to locate Edith, who is inconsolable. Dracula attacks him before he can reach Edith, while Blade is forced to violently push Frank away to save him from the Black Widows. They then hear Edith's screams and rush to her rescue, while at the entrance, Rachel and Harker fear the worst. Dracula fights off Blade and tries to push him off the balcony, but the Daywalker grabs the chandelier and saves himself. Frank Drake tries to attack his ancestor with an axe, but gets swatted away, and Blade uses this opening to pounce on Dracula. He slashes Dracula's face with his wooden daggers, which causes him to jump out the window and flee. And for now, the day seems to have been saved. But when they check on Edith, they realize that she has been infected, and she throws herself off the balcony before she can hurt them. While she is knocked out, Harker is forced to make the hard call and end the misery of his own daughter. He and Blade now share the same thirst for revenge when it comes to Dracula, and it won't be easy for them to let it go. Then the vampire hunters mourn Edith's death, and none can match the void Harker now feels, having been forced to kill his own daughter. Frank, meanwhile, takes his anger out on Blade, who simply shrugs it off. He suggests that they should bury Edith, but Harker denies him, stating that she will be cremated, as is the method of his organization. Dracula, meanwhile, saves a woman named Cecile from getting raped, only to then infect her so that he can call upon her as his slave when required. Dracula then goes to the sports arena to catch up on what humanity has been up to in the 20th century. We then head to the Scotland Yard morgue, where a man named Mr. Lowe bribes his way into it to secure Lucas Brand's body. When the mission is accomplished, Mr. Lowe kills everyone so as not to leave any evidence behind. Meanwhile, at the sports arena, Dracula is appalled to learn that humanity still finds solace in fake fights, which he finds to be pathetic and revolting. He has seen enough and flies off to return to his current abode. While back at Harker's place, Blade tells everyone about his birth and how he hunts vampires to find Deacon Frost, the murderer of his mother. He then tells them not to lecture him about grief again, because he has lost enough people to the undead, and this leaves everyone speechless, especially Frank. Dracula, meanwhile, is unaware that Harker is in cahoots with Scotland Yard, and so when he flies a bit low in a valley, he gets spotted spotted. After all, there aren't many huge bats flying around before the sun rises above the horizon. Dracula returns to the remote morgue that he has turned into his lair and decides to rest, but little does he know that Harker and the rest are minutes away from his abode. Harker is tipped off by Scotland Yard, and they decide to stop and question the town's postmaster about Dracula, only to learn that the man, and likely the entire town, is under Dracula's influence. They rush off to find him, but Dracula's psionic link with the townspeople tips him off to their presence. He prepares for their arrival, and the epic confrontation unfortunately doesn't go in his favor. He gets shot by one of Rachel's arrows, then he gets tackled by Taj. Blade attacks him next, and this is when we see the townsfolk rushing to their master's aid. Dracula grabs Rachel and takes her hostage, and when Taj tries to save her, Dracula throws him out of the window and into the moat below. This is when Harker reveals the ace up his sleeve. He has a dart thrower built into his wheelchair, but Dracula avoids the wooden darts by turning into mist. He then tries to attack Harker, only for Blade to ambush him and stab him in the heart. Dracula's limp body falls to the ground as the rest of them struggle to accept the fact that they have finally killed the king of the undead. However, their victory is short-lived as the banging on the door of the castle soon distracts them. The townsfolk and Dracula's slaves are here, and they overpower the vampire hunters and take away Dracula's corpse in a coffin. Harker tried to get Blade to sever Dracula's head, so he wouldn't be able to resurrect again, but the townsfolk were too dangerous, and Blade couldn't pry himself away from the door. As the townsfolk carry away Dracula, his corpse begins to wither, and eventually his flesh falls off his bones. This is when he loses his power over the townsfolk, and upon realizing what they were doing, they all quickly drop the coffin and run away. Nearby, at the Church of the Forever Resurrected, Father Josiah Dawn is questioning his faith because of the lack of people attending the church. He demands a sign from God, and this is when he spots Dracula's coffin in the distance. He runs to it, finds Dracula's corpse, and then decides that he will resurrect this corpse to popularize his church again. For 3 nights, Josiah spreads the word of God and how he will resurrect someone 3 days later, and this attracts a huge crowd. Pamphlets are printed around the towns, one of which eventually reaches the vampire hunters, and upon realizing that Josiah is about to resurrect Dracula, they all rush to the event. Josiah makes a huge speech, the crowd is on his side, and this is when he reaches out to pull the dagger. Blade manages to reach the event in the nick of time, but the crowd is too dense for him to get through. He tries to warn Josiah, but the priest doesn't heed his advice and pulls out the dagger anyway. Dracula comes back to life and he taunts Josiah for not listening to Blade. But then all goes sideways as the churchgoers pull out their crosses, especially Josiah, who has a big ancient cross. They begin clawing at Dracula, and the Lord of the Undead is caught off guard. He turns into mist and then shuns them away, but when Josiah doesn't back down, Dracula summons a bolt of lightning which destroys his cross and Josiah's body. Even in his dying moments, Josiah refuses to give up on his faith, which angers Dracula. He transforms into his bat form, proclaims that he will rule them all, and then flies away. The next dire confrontation between Blade and Dracula will be a tough one to swallow. Dracula is in Paris, France, and this is when we are reintroduced to one of his weaknesses. Dracula needs to rest too, and when he needs to rest, coffins lined with Transylvanian earth are his best bet. Earth from his homeland, and so he has such coffins hidden around the world in strategic places. And when it comes to Paris, his precious coffin lies in the infamous catacombs beneath the city. 6 million dead corpses ought to hide his hideous form while he recovers, right? Sadly, that's not the case. Someone has been hunting down Dracula's coffins that help him recover, and when he heads into the catacombs, he is heartbroken to discover that his coffin has been destroyed. But before he can mourn his loss, Blade calls out to him, for he is the one who has been destroying Dracula's coffins, depriving him of the ability to recover. Blade gloats and charges at Dracula, only to learn that the king of the undead isn't as powerless as he might have hoped. Dracula isn't only driven by anger, but there's a hint of revenge in his blows. Blade has fought and defeated many of Dracula's legions, and thus it seems that the time has come for Blade to answer for his crimes against the undead. Dracula slams Blade on the ground, declares that it's time to end this, and then Dracula bites Blade in the neck, drains his blood, and leaves him for dead. He then transforms into a bat and flies away, and now that he knows that most of his safe locations have been compromised, Dracula decides to capitalize on one of his minions. He heads to the house of Henry Verne, one of the many humans under his influence. There, Henry helps him rest for a bit, and then, when his master commands, Henry helps Dracula board a train that would lead him back to Transylvania. But this train that Dracula boards is a can of worms waiting to be unleashed, for aboard it are not only Rachel Van Helsing and Frank Drake, but also a man named Gruber and his bodyguard, Garnet. As you may have guessed, Rachel and Frank are here hunting Dracula, waiting for him to make his move. But as for Gruber, he is transporting some very important documents that somehow tie back to Dr. Sun, the man who has been conducting his own experiments to weaponize vampires. Gruber is jumpy. He is afraid that the documents will be stolen from him, but that doesn't stop him from indulging in his desires, for contrary to all his apprehensions, he ends up sending Garnet to fetch him a drink to end his night. Coincidentally, Dracula too is walking through the lobby looking for a drink when he comes across a fellow named Jack Russell. Little do either of them know that they are fated to cross paths again very soon. As for Dr. Sun, his experiments proved to be fruitful, for Lucas Brand, the vampire whom he recovered not long ago, is able to defeat every man he throws at him. Sun welcomes Brand into his organization. While back on the train, Dracula seduces and lures a young mother into his cabin so that he can feed on her to revitalize himself. However, this slip-up costs him dearly, because when the woman's screams echo throughout the train, Rachel and Frank rush to his cabin. Dracula turns into mist and flees the scene, but when he returns to continue his journey back to Transylvania, he is confronted by Gruber and Garnet. Garnet tries to shoot him, but the bullet has little to no effect on Dracula, who mocks the bodyguard and then throws him out of the train. Dracula assumes that these two are in cahoots with Rachel and Frank, and Gruber flees the scene before Dracula can learn the truth. He then has to fight off Rachel and Frank again when he tries to follow Gruber, and Dracula makes quick work of them. However, he doesn't finish them off and instead warns them that their doom will be served when they face each other at his castle. He then catches up to Gruber, who warns him that he and his master are not to be trifled with. He also gloats about his documents, but the Lord of the Undead isn't really concerned with his babbling. He instead reveals to Gruber that he is a vampire, which prompts the stranger to throw himself out of the train. Confused, Dracula has little time to infer what just transpired. For the very next second, he is attacked by Rachel and her crossbow. Dracula flees, and Gruber's body and the documents are found by an agent of Dr. Sun, who makes a cryptic phone call and informs the man on the other end that their mission has been successful. Meanwhile, back in the catacombs, an unconscious Blade is found by Quincy Harker, who upon seeing the fang marks on his neck fears the worst. Dracula has finally managed to kill his most feared foe, and so Quincy has no choice but to pull out a wooden stake to finish the job. First it was Edith, and now it'll be Blade. Quincy is always forced to make the hardest choice, but before he can stab Blade, we switch back to Dracula's story, where he is faced with Jack Russell once again. You see, Jack Russell is a werewolf, and the search for answers has led him and his lover, Topaz, to Dracula's castle. Dracula tries to subdue the two of them, only to learn that not only is Jack a werewolf, but his lover, Topaz, has powers of her own that fight Dracula whenever she stares at the Lord of the Undead. The confrontation ends with Dracula swatting Topaz away like a fly and then subduing Jack so that he can feed on him in his werewolf form. Meanwhile, back in the catacombs, just when Quincy is about to stab and kill Blade, he comes back to life and tells Harker to hold his horses. Harker is naturally flabbergasted, and this is when Blade explains to him that he is immune to vampire bites. He then vows to use his immunity to hunt the undead. As for the rest of the vampire hunters, well, their fate is convoluted to say the least. Rachel finds herself in a Mexican standoff with Dracula because both of them are being forced to rely on each other to survive in the Alps. You see, Rachel stole the second book of sins and tried to flee in a helicopter. Dracula went after her, which forced the two of them to crash in the Alps. Dracula saved her life, and both of them are now relying on each other to survive the winter wasteland. Dracula feeds on a goat and brings back the meat for Rachel. Neither of them is ready to trust the other, but fate continues to force them to rely on each other. The standoff ends when Frank ends up finding Rachel. He is in another helicopter that he hired, and he manages to rescue her, and they both leave Dracula to survive the harsh environment on his own. Eyes on Frost. Blade is now about to shift his focus. Dracula is the bigger target, but his thirst for revenge leads him to go after Deacon Frost once again. You see, Blade finds himself back in London at Harker's residence, while none of them are privy to the fact that Rachel and Frank have been captured by Dr. Sun back in Transylvania. The worst part? Dracula is one of the prisoners too, and they are being tortured by Sun through his backstory and his experiments on Bran. Harker pleads with Blade to stay. His services have been invaluable disagreeable, but Blade tells the man that he needs to stay active. He can't sit around and wait for answers like Harker. While Harker searches for Dracula and another opening to kill the King of the Undead, Blade is going to go off on his own and look for Deacon Frost. Blade is certain that the vampire is alive, and he wants answers. Answers for why Deacon killed his mother, why and how Blade got his powers, and what Deacon's intention was in the first place. Taj tries to stop Blade as he leaves, but this is when he gets aggressive, and Harker is forced to call off his bodyguard. We then catch up with Blade as he returns to his apartment that he shares with the love of his life, Saffron Calder. She is being attacked by a vampire who was hoping to break him by killing Saffron, but Blade instantly tackles the man and stabs him in the shoulder with one of his wooden daggers. This is when the vampire mocks Blade and removes the dagger from his shoulder, while explaining that the daggers won't have any effect on him because he is too fast. The vampire then spins around and holds Saffron hostage using Blade's own weapon. He reveals that he has been sent here by Dracula, who is demanding to see Blade. But before he can gloat anymore, Blade chucks a dagger at him and stabs him through the heart. Saffron and he then share a tender kiss, but Dracula continues to invade Blade's life, and this time he does it through Saffron's friend, Trudy, who shows up at their apartment late at night. Trudy is a showgirl who performs in a club every night, but tonight something harrowing happened that caused her to seek out Blade. You see, Dracula was in the crowd tonight while Trudy was performing. Unfortunately, she did not know who he was. Dracula used his charm to seduce her, and Trudy fell for it. In hindsight, Trudy confesses that there were a lot of red flags. Firstly, she was supposed to meet her man Ralphie tonight, yet her boyfriend seemingly didn't matter while she was with Dracula. Then there were the sharp fangs. They should have been a dead giveaway, but something was making her feel giddy and lightheaded around him. She couldn't think straight, which is why she ignored the teeth. Trudy took Dracula to her apartment, and he told her that he was a foreigner in England, and that he was an immigrant from Transylvania. And Trudy recounts how Dracula seemed too excited when he mentioned the name of his country. Trudy then went into her bedroom to change out of her work clothes, and that is when Dracula decided to pounce on her. Trudy heard a low, guttural growl before she was slammed onto the bed, and this is when she instinctively reached out and grabbed the cross hanging by her bedside. Trudy shoved the cross in Dracula's face, and the symbol seared into his flesh. It began to burn and sizzle, which caused him to let go of Trudy. Dracula reeled back and screamed and then leapt out the window and fled. Trudy rushed to the window and looked out, only to realize that there was no body on the ground. Whatever that man was, whatever that thing was, had somehow managed to flee without leaving any trace. Delirious and scared out of her mind, Trudy grabbed her coat and rushed out into the street. She was desperate for help, and she wanted to go to the police first, but soon she realized that they would never believe her. This is when she remembered what Saffron had told her about Blade and began to run toward their apartment. But Trudy's despair didn't stop there. Dracula continued to haunt her in this bat form. He would swoop down over and over again and claw at her bare flesh with his talons, and everyone on the street refused to help her. They simply turned a blind eye to her, maybe because of what she was wearing. Trudy's cross was her only respite, the only thing keeping the bat away. Even the policeman who witnessed her plight refused to help her, for the easy thing to do was to assume that she was some stricken showgirl on drugs. Trudy knows that Dracula's still out there waiting for her in his bat form, and to her surprise, Blade doesn't question her. He believes everything she said, and he gets dressed and then heads out to take care of the King of the Undead once and for all. Blade doesn't know that it's Dracula in his bat form. He assumes it's just another vindictive vampire. But when Dracula lays his eyes on the Daywalker, he chuckles with amusement, for tonight brings the opportunity to kill Blade once and for all. He picks the right moment, swoops down, and shoves Blade in front of an oncoming bus. Blade manages to avoid getting crushed to death by moving his body between the tires in the nick of time. The wafting warmth of the engine brushes his face as he avoids certain death, and when the bat swoops down again, Blade avoids it by jumping through the window of a nearby sporting goods store. Dracula continues to attack Blade over and over again, who can't seem to find an opening to kill the horrid creature. Blade heads upstairs in the store in an attempt to find more room and manages to stab the bat with a ski poker. The creature doesn't stop there, however. Dracula uses all his might and shoves Blade down the stairs. He swoops down once again to attack him, but this time Blade manages to stab him in the wing with one of his wooden daggers. Dracula reels back in pain and flies away, and Blade returns home after having told Scotland Yard about his encounter. Blade will then cross paths with Dracula again in Boston sometime later. Remember Dr. Sun, who stole the body of the vampire Lucas Brand not so long ago? Well, he has had a horrid past, and he is about to become a nuisance for Dracula and Blade. You see, Dr. Sun was a prisoner of the Chinese government in 1966 during the Cultural Revolution. Because of his impressive IQ, the government forced Dr. Sun into an experiment where his brain was removed from his body and placed into an antimatter container that was wired to an experimental computer. And this tale of his past, it is being told to Dracula, Rachel Van Helsing, and Frank Drake by Lucas Brand, who are his and Dr. Sun's prisoner. The Chinese government had hoped to unlock some secret hidden knowledge by connecting the most genius mind on Earth to the most advanced computers on the planet, but they got more than they had bargained for. For Dr. Sun ended up becoming extremely powerful, and he used his mental powers to instantly destroy his tormentors. Dr. Sun would soon learn that he wasn't so different from vampires in his current state. He too required fresh blood to sustain himself, which is why he has been so interested in their kind. Dr. Sun plans to use Lucas Brand and Dracula to unlock the secrets of vampirism, so that he can have an army of his own using Dracula's superior powers. Sun then frees Dracula and unleashes him on his minion Lucas Brand as a final test of his abilities. The two undead begin to fight, and Lucas Brand gains the upper hand when he manages to drive a stake through Dracula's heart after a heated struggle. When this happens, adrenaline rushes through his body, and with the last bit of his strength, Dracula strikes, takes down Brand, and then collapses on the floor himself. When Dracula wakes up, he finds himself strapped to an experimental machine, and after gloating about how his plan has come to fruition, Dr. Sun has Brand strap himself into the same machine, and the process then begins. You see, Dr. Sun plans to extract Dracula's intelligence and memories, which will not only be stored in his databanks, but will also be transferred over to Brand so that Sun's plans for the future can become a reality. How is Brand under the complete control of Dr. Sun, you ask? The man has been drugged out of his mind for months, and only when he exhibited complete subordination was he allowed to roam free. The process begins. Both Brand and Dracula scream in pain as the invasive experiment takes effect. But then Brand ends up breaking free before the process can be completed. His intention? To kill Dracula, and the Lord of Darkness frees himself to face his new foe. However, Dracula has been weakened by this process, and so he turns into his bat form and feeds on Sun's scientists to regain some of his strength. The two then begin to trade blows, and this is when Sun realizes that Brand was the wrong choice. Even in his weakened state, Brand is no match for Dracula, which means he is going to have to improvise a new plan. Dr. Sun frees Rachel and Frank, gives them their weapons, and asks them to do their job as vampire hunters and take out both vampires. However, Brand realizes that Sun has turned on him. He destroys Rachel and Frank's weapons and then turns on Dr. Sun. When Dracula tries to attack him, Brand throws him into a bunch of equipment that starts a fire that threatens to engulf the entire facility. Brand then attacks Dr. Sun. However, Sun incapacitates the inferior vampire with a mental bolt and then teleports out of the facility. Rachel and Frank leave the facility in the nick of time before it explodes, while everyone assumes that Dracula has perished in the explosion. And thus now we find ourselves in Boston, and a lot has transpired since Dracula's last face-off with Dr. Sun. He has been destroyed, and it is Quincy Harker and the other vampire hunters who try to revive him. When nothing works, the tears of the woman who loves the Lord of Darkness bring him back to life. Why did they resurrect him? They want his help to destroy Dr. Sun, but first Dracula needs to feed, and though they try to offer him some ethically sourced blood, Dracula laughs at them and then heads out to feed on a suitable young woman that would get him back to full strength. Dracula feeds on a woman named Cynthia Cullen, who would go on to become a notorious vampire herself. Then he is attacked by Blade, who has been framed by Dracula's coven for the murder of an innocent man, or so he believes. Blade tries to kill Dracula, but when he learns that the Lord of Darkness has aligned forces with Quincy Harker and the other hunters, he is baffled and accompanies him to their safe house for some much-needed answers. There he learns about Dr. Sun and how he has become quite a significant threat. Blade refuses, explains the actions of Dracula's coven against Saffron, and then refuses to help them. The conversation gets heated when he learns that Quincy willingly brought Dracula back to life, and he storms out of the safe house after telling Aurora that Dracula doesn't love her and that he would kill her when he gets bored of her. Dracula decides to finish the job on his own and takes off into the night in his bat form to scout Dr. Sun's hideout. Little does he know that Blade is hot on his tail. The Daywalker wants to confirm that Dracula won't betray Harker and the others when his motive has been fulfilled. Dracula brazenly enters Sun's hideout and begins killing anyone who stands in his way. Dr. Sun dispatches his army of soldiers to kill Dracula, while Blade stealthily makes his way into the facility. Dracula makes quick work of the soldiers, attacking him and even hypnotizes one of them and forces the man to commit suicide. He then faces a helpless Dr. Sun who tries to use his mental bolts against Dracula, but ends up missing. This is when he is joined by Blade to finally take down this telepathic threat. This commotion has attracted the attention of someone mysterious, someone Blade has been searching for, Deacon Frost. Frost flies in and then transforms and perches up on a vantage point to watch the fight happening below. Sun's soldiers put up a valiant fight, but they're no match for Blade, and upon realizing this, Sun triggers a trap door beneath Blade's feet, which plunges him into a spike trap. Blade uses his hands and feet to avoid certain death, but the blood from his scrapes starts causing him to slip. Meanwhile, the other hunters decide that they need to join the fight to take a more active role in destroying Dr. Sun, and so they make their move. Blade, meanwhile, continues to struggle while Dr. Sun torments Dracula with the powers he stole from the vampire earlier. He forces Dracula to transform into mist, while the other hunters slowly sneak into Sun's safe house. Blade, meanwhile, manages to pull himself out of the pit only to find himself face to face with more of Sun's soldiers. They start attacking him, and though Blade ducks and avoids the blow, he soon gets distracted by Deacon Frost, and this is when he is knocked in the face by the butt of a rifle and is instantly knocked out. As for Dracula, he has managed to get a hold of his mist form and is now attacking Sun's brain, which prompts Sun to adopt a different strategy. He begins manifesting light beams in the shape of crosses to keep Dracula at bay, which prompts the Lord of Darkness to call upon the Dark Gods, and this allows him to fight off Sun's attacks. He then reabsorbs the powers Sun stole from him while Blade comes back to consciousness outside, only to realize that Deacon Frost has fled the scene. This is when Rachel and the hunters arrive at the scene only to witness Dr. Sun's equipment exploding, which leaves his brain on the ground, out of its protective casing. Dracula then reappears and saves their new member Harold from getting struck by one of Sun's mental blasts when he gets close enough. Though the bolt misses Harold, it strikes another piece of equipment, which results in another huge explosion, causing all of them to flee. But before they do so, they watch as Dr. Sun's brain seemingly combusts in the fire. This is when Blade screams and tells everyone about Deacon Frost, how he spotted the vampire during the fight, and that Dracula can either help him capture the undead creature or die by his hands right here and now. The next part of the story is found in an article written by Paul Butterworth that was supposed to have been published. Paul is a reporter who was hot on the trail of Dracula after having been told about 2 murders where the victims had the blood drained from their bodies. The first victim was Marianne Travers and the second was Margaret Simmons. This got Paul thinking about vampires and whether they were actually real, and coincidentally, this is when he hears an advertisement for Harold's book, True Vampire Stories, on the radio. Paul tracks down Harold, who accurately recounts the confrontation with Dr. Sun for him. But when it comes to telling him about Blade and Dracula's confrontation after the fight, Harold embellishes the story and tells Paul that he saved Blade's life when Dracula refused to help him and sent the creature scurrying away. Paul sees through this blatant lie, but decides not to probe Harold. Instead, he asks for Blade's address, which Harold graciously provides. And so, Paul finds himself on the way to the hotel room where Blade and the other vampire hunters are staying. But then, while scanning the police radio frequencies, he hears reports of a Dracula attack. Paul rushes to the location and manages to take a photo of Dracula, which angers the Lord of Darkness. He lunges at Paul, who slips on the ice and whose cross necklace pops out. Dracula turns into a bat and flies away, and eventually Paul finds himself face to face with Blade and the rest of the hunters. Blade then recounts the rest of the story. Dracula didn't like being ordered around, so he refused to help Blade find the murderer of his mother. This prompted a battle between the two of them, and when things began to go against him, Rachel stepped in and fired an arrow at Dracula, which forced him to flee. Meanwhile, Dracula has managed to track them to the hotel room. He bursts in and catches the hunters off guard, but once again he is thwarted by Paul and his cross. Dracula vows to exact revenge. He can't believe that a puny human like Paul Paul has thwarted him twice. And thus, this is why Paul is typing this article frantically in his newsroom when he is found and ambushed by Dracula. But Paul is prepared. He has a revolver full of silver bullets as well as a sharpened wooden cross. But Paul unloads all the bullets too soon. Dracula powers through the effects of the wooden cross and then begins to toy with his prey by chucking Paul around the room. Dracula then shoves him through a glass door, and this is when Paul notices the light coming from behind the curtains and quickly pulls them open. Realizing that dawn was just minutes away, Dracula fled the scene, and Paul's life was saved again. Sadly, Paul lost his job as a featured journalist because when he developed the photos of Dracula, they turned up blank, and his boss would not print his story without concrete proof. Instead, Paul was demoted and ordered to write for the Ask Miss Annie column. The fated meeting with Hannibal King. Now it's time for Blade to cross paths with Dr. Strange, who has been searching for Wong. Wong has been missing for some time now, and Strange uses the Eye of Agamotto to locate him. Unfortunately, when he gets back to the sanctum, Strange discovers that Wong has been bitten by a vampire, and thus, to prevent the curse from setting in, Strange freezes Wong in time. He then uses his astral form to enter Wong's mind, and this is when he discovers that Wong was attacked by Dracula when he tried to save a woman who was about to become his victim. Vowing revenge, Dr. Strange heads out to face Dracula on his own, who meanwhile has been taking out his anger on what remains of Dr. Sun's equipment in his former lair. This has now become one of Dracula's safe houses, and it now contains a coffin for him that is lined with Transylvanian dirt. As for Blade, well, someone has tipped him off about an apartment that supposedly belongs to Deacon Frost, and thus Blade is staking out that apartment tonight. Little does he know that Deacon Frost himself is out stalking and keeping a close eye on Dracula. Dracula goes to rest in his coffin but is soon woken up by Dr. Strange's mystical presence when the latter manages to track him down to his safe house. Dr. Strange hits Dracula with all his might, but the Lord of Darkness survives the attack. Dr. Strange then tries to bind him with the crimson bands of Cyttorak, but Dracula quickly changes into his mist form and avoids getting caught. And so, as a last resort, Dr. Strange hits Dracula with the images of Icon to learn about his worst fears, and the two of them relive his fight and eventual death at the hands of Turok. However, this has left Strange powerless. Dracula refuses to help Strange bring back Wong and instead attacks him. Dracula manages to hypnotize Strange and gets ready to feast on his blood. While this happens, Blade's stakeout finally comes to fruition when someone enters the mysterious apartment. Blade instantly bursts in through the window to confront the man, only to learn that this isn't Deacon Frost, but the famed vampire detective Hannibal King. Upon realizing that Hannibal King is a vampire, Blade instantly attacks him, despite the man pleading with him to listen to his cause. Having no other choice at hand, Hannibal King subdues Blade and warns him that if he continues attacking him, they both will lose their lead on Deacon Frost. Hannibal too has been searching for the same man, and so it would be in their interests to join forces. Blade begrudgingly stops, and King explains to him that he was turned into a vampire by Frost, which is why he is hungry for revenge. Blade isn't convinced. He sneakily tries to attack King again, but Hannibal thwarts his attempt easily. He then shows Blade Frost's latest victim hidden in the apartment, and then advises him that they both should wait for the man to rise as a vampire so that they can question him about Frost. Seeing that Blade is still on the fence, King reassures him that he has never fed on a human, nor had any intention of spreading the curse of vampirism, which finally ends up convincing Blade to join forces with him. As for Dr. Strange, over the course of a few issues in his own comic, he has not only managed to defeat Dracula, but he has also resurrected and cured Wong. But Dracula isn't dead, and he will soon take over the cult of Satanists in the city, along with a new bride named Domini, who was being offered as a sacrifice to Satan by the cult's leader, Anton Lupesky. Back at the apartment, when Deacon Frost's latest victim rises, Hannibal and Blade quickly corner him and start asking him pertinent questions. The man tells them that he is a gravedigger who was hired by Frost to dig up a very specific grave. When the job was done, the man demanded payment, which ironically was offered to him in the form of the curse of vampirism. The two of them then question him about the coffin, and this is when the sacred vampire tells them that the body in it was an exact replica of Blade, and that he heard Frost mention that with this duplicate body, he could rule the world. King and Blade then head to the location given to them by Frost's latest victim, but on the way, both of them are puzzled. How the hell will Blade's duplicate allow Frost to rule the world? They take a short detour from their hunt for Frost to pick up Saffron, who has just flown to Boston to reunite with Blade. Saffron has left London because frankly the city became quite boring to her now that Blade had left. Their hunt continues, and by nightfall, Hannibal and Blade find themselves perched on the roof of a building that overlooks another apartment which seemingly contains all the answers that they have been searching for. Hannibal is the calm-headed one. He suggests that they should stake out the apartment, maybe enter it stealthily if they see no signs of life. But by now, Blade has grown impatient beyond measure. This hunt has gone on for too long, and he simply can't be convinced to wait any longer. Blade storms to the front door, kicks it in, and then walks inside only to get the shock of his life. The rumors were true. Frost indeed resurrected his doppelganger, who looks exactly like him. He is even wearing the same clothes and wielding the same weapons. The only difference? The doppelganger is a vampire. His doppelganger mocks Blade and then claims that he is going to kill Blade and take his place. And thus, the fated battle begins, and instantly Blade's doppelganger gains the upper hand. After all, he is a vampire, and he moves with the speed of the undead, and thrusts his dagger with a force that can only be mustered by a vampire. He manages to slash Blade in the face, which prompts Blade to chuck his dagger at him. The dagger pierces the doppelganger's wrist and pins him to the wall, but this is when the undead creature reveals another one of his powers. He can turn into mist. The doppelganger then appears behind Blade and rushes him without any weapon. As soon as the two of them make contact, their bodies begin to fuse together. Blade panics, but he can't seem to pull away from his doppelganger. Blade tries to kill the creature and stabs him in the shoulder, but the creature doubles down on his effort, and the merge intensifies. Hannibal King tries to help his ally, but the deed is done. The two bodies have fused together, and what remains of Blade is seemingly lost forever. The unified body is now in full control of the doppelganger, and the creature now turns its sights on Hannibal King to take him down once and for all. But Hannibal King is no slouch. When the doppelganger leaps at him armed with Blade's daggers, Hannibal King grabs him, falls on his back, and easily chucks the creature away. He then throws him onto his head, and when the doppelganger tries to stab him with a dagger, Hannibal pulls out a dagger of his own and slashes him in the face. Before the doppelganger can recover, he pulls out another hidden dagger and stabs the creature in the chest, and then jumps out of the window to make his escape. But even though daylight shines, the doppelganger doesn't just let Hannibal King escape. It transforms into a bat and gives chase. The bat shoves Hannibal through a wooden fence, which to King's advantage gives him an improvised wooden stake. Hannibal quickly grabs it and then stabs the doppelganger in the sternum. As the creature staggers to regain its composure, Hannibal bursts into the nearby mansion, only to be confronted by Dracula and a lavish party that he has been hosting. To his surprise, Deacon Frost is also in attendance, but before Hannibal can make his move, he is quickly tackled to the ground by the doppelganger. Enraged that Blade has the gall to crash his party like this, Dracula jumps into action and attacks his longtime foe, completely unaware that this is a doppelganger. He smacks Blade into the dinner table while Frost smiles coyly in the background. Turns out, this is all part of his plan. Dracula then grabs Blade by the throat and shoves him against the wall, and this is when he learns that Blade has turned into a full vampire. Anton, meanwhile, leads Dracula's pregnant bride, Domini, to safety while the fight rages on. This distraction, however, gives Hannibal King enough time to recover and confront Deacon Frost. Frost panics, instantly turns into mist form, and flees, and before Hannibal can chase and grab him, he goes to a balcony, transforms into a bat, and then flies away. As for the battle between the doppelganger and Dracula, two of them have now picked up sharp wooden legs from broken tables to duel with each other. Dracula stabs the doppelganger, but so does the creature, though his blow isn't powerful enough to pierce the Lord of Darkness's ribcage. Dracula grabs the doppelganger, lifts him in the air, and then slams him on the ground. Dracula turns away to grab another stake, and this is when the creature ambushes him and stabs him in the back. But unfortunately, he misses Dracula's heart, who pulls the stake from his torso and then stabs the doppelganger in the heart while proclaiming that he is no match for the skills of the original Blade. Blade, seemingly dead, is buried by his loved ones, but little do they know that Hannibal King isn't about to give up anytime soon. He tracks down Damon Hellstrom, the son of Satan, believing that the man can help exorcise Blade and bring him back to life. And thus, on a fated night, while storm winds adorn the night sky in an eerie graveyard, Hannibal and Damon find themselves walking through it, armed with nothing but a shovel and determination. Hannibal spots Blade's grave and begins digging. Once they have dug enough, they pull out the coffin. Hannibal expresses doubt. Would Damon be able to do the job? And Damon reassures him that separating good from evil is his specialty. Now assured, Hannibal slams the shovel between the two coffin plates and forces it open. Damon learns that thankfully this is only the third night since Blade fused with his doppelganger, which means there's a high chance that he will survive. Damon then summons his powers, transforms into the son of Satan, and then performs the exorcism. He then pulls the stake out of the doppelganger's chest, and the creature instantly comes back to life. Before he can attack, Damon finishes the ritual and separates Blade from his doppelganger. Hannibal then jumps into action instantly and stabs the doppelganger in the chest with the same stake once again. The creature dies and is buried in the same coffin, while Blade thanks the two of them for all they've done, although his legs still feel shaky and his mind seems very foggy. The next step for Blade is to gather his bearings and go visit Saffron to reassure her that he is still alive. They have a much-needed heartfelt conversation, and then Blade tells her that he is going to finish this once and for all. Hannibal King has found Deacon Frost's hideout, and tonight is the fated night when they end his life. As the two of them make their way to the graveyard with Frost's hideout, they have a heart-to-heart conversation. King expresses how he hates being this creature. The lack of reflection in the mirror, the thirst for blood, it all makes him feel very unnatural. Sometimes it even makes him cry. And for the first time in a very long time, Blade relates to someone in this world, someone who shares the same self-disgust and the same emotions. He doesn't say much, simply asks King if he's doing okay, and King knows that this is Blade's way of telling him that he cares. King, however, isn't good with emotions, just like Blade, so both of them are relieved when they reach Frost's safe house before either of them is forced to break the ice. King begins to dig at a grave with a hidden underground passage, and they both enter it and walk below to confront Frost. Under the graveyard, they find a huge, ornate, and opulent chamber. Frost clearly had a lot of time to craft his lair to his own preferences. King then begins to catch Blade up on all he has found about Deacon Frost's past. There used to be a Deacon Frost in Germany back in 1863, which makes him around 110 years old. He was a chemist with delusions of grandeur. He would conduct unsanctioned, inhumane, and unwanted experiments on unsuspecting victims. One of his experiments was infecting a woman with the blood of a recently deceased vampire. This is when her lover burst in to save her, and in the struggle, Frost was infected with the vampire blood that he had procured. But there was something different about the blood, for it wasn't pure. Frost had experimented with it and had crafted some sort of pseudo-serum. And this serum gave Frost unique abilities never before seen in any other vampire, not even Dracula himself. This is when Frost bursts onto the scene and reveals that his unique powers include creating doppelgangers of existing vampires. And this is when he reveals that he has an army of doppelgangers at his disposal, an army that is fashioned after Blade and Hannibal King. And thus their battle begins, which is a convoluted chaos of flying bodies. But this time, Blade and King fight tactfully. They help each other, watch each other's backs, and in a surprising moment, Blade even calls King a dear friend. A few minutes later, all of Frost's doppelgangers have been slain. But this is when Frost laughs, mocks them, claims that the two of them have only delayed the inevitable, and then makes his escape in his bat form. The two of them, however, aren't about to give up so easily. They chase Frost and corner him in one of his labs. Frost threatens to throw a jar of flesh-rotting fungus at them, but before he can do so, they both throw their daggers at him and stab him through the heart. The jar breaks and the fungus begins consuming Frost, and thus, in a last-ditch attempt to take Hannibal and Blade with him, he falls back on his equipment and triggers a bunch of explosions. Blade and Hannibal narrowly escape the explosion, and with that, Blade has finally exacted revenge on the murderer of his mother. Hannibal and Blade then part ways on good terms and become the best of friends. The formation of Night Stalkers. Then Blade, Hannibal King, and Frank Drake would go on to form a detective agency of their own called Borderline Investigative Services. They would specialize in supernatural cases, but they would soon break up when Frank Drake would abandon them. Blade would be committed to a mental hospital after he battled a temporarily resurrected Dracula. However, this all would come to change when Doctor Strange would decide to intervene, when Lilith began tugging the strings of fate. You see, the veil between Earth and her realm had been weakening, and Lilith was now making moves in the background to rip open this veil so that she could unleash her wrath on the world. And at the center of this conflict was Ghost Rider, the Spirit of Vengeance, as well as Johnny Blade, the former host of the Spirit of Vengeance. And so we catch up with Ghost Rider as he chases one of Lilith's Lilin named Nakota. She has managed to escape from their last encounter, but not for long. Ghost Rider corners her in a diner at night, and Nakota desperately calls out to her mother in an attempt to escape her demise. Ghost Rider uses his penance stare on Nakota, which instantly incapacitates her. But through this entire experience, Ghost Rider is bestowed with visions of the near future, a vision which shows him 3 men who will aid them in the fight that is about to come. He sees Hannibal King, Frank Drake, and Blade the Daywalker. Meanwhile, back in Boston, we see Frank Drake struggling with frequent nightmares about Dracula, where the Lord of Darkness constantly mocks and taunts him. Right now, however, he is visiting the New England Museum with his wife Marlene. She snaps him out of his visions, and they then begin to watch and admire one of the whales in the aquarium. But then Frank's hallucinations continue. He watches in horror as the whale convulses, sinks to the bottom of the tank, and then something begins to poke out of its stomach. Suddenly, the whale's flesh tears open, and Frank watches in horror as Lilith's huge form comes spilling out of its body, covered in guts and blood. Frank then loses that vision and is relieved to know that the whale was simply facing a bit of anxiety, and is right now being calmed down by a couple of divers. But something is indeed direly wrong. Marlene, his wife, has gone into a state of catatonia. She is completely unresponsive, and the security staff is compelled to drag the 2 of them away so that they can call for help. Little does Frank know that Doctor Strange has been watching everything by blending into the crowd, and once he has left, Strange says, "So little to ask, too much to hope for." We then head to the mental hospital where Blade is being kept. He is assigned to Dr. Reitgerg, who is briefing Doctor Strange on Blade's current condition. Doctor Strange isn't here as the Sorcerer Supreme, but instead in his capacity as an actual doctor. He tells Strange about what happened on Halloween, how Blade attacked an innocent patient who was simply wearing a crude costume of a vampire. He was using candy corn for fangs, for Christ's sake. In Dr. Reitgerg's opinion, this has undone any progress Blade might have made over the past year or so, and it has also slashed any hopes for a full recovery. Regardless, Doctor Strange uses his position to propose a new form of therapy for Blade, a therapy that would require the Daywalker to be transferred to Strange's facility. Reitgerg puts his foot down and tells Strange that he will express his disapproval and displeasure officially on the record. However, Strange doesn't care, for Reitgerg doesn't know that he is dealing with the fate of the world here. Blade is let go from the facility, but his equipment isn't handed back to him. But Doctor Strange has his back, and he produces it for Blade using his magic. The Daywalker then heads to Borderline Investigative Services, where he reunites with his old friend and ally, Hannibal King. King, however, is having troubles of his own. The temptation of human blood is now getting to him, and it is getting increasingly difficult for King to control his urges. Meanwhile, Lilith tracks down another of her Lilin named Meat Market, who is currently hunting down a man named Justin Hoyt. The Lilin sacrifices the man in honor of his mother as she appears, and she is quite pleased by the gesture. Then Meat Market shows her the scroll he made using human skin, a scroll that depicts the 9 people who would cause her torment and stand in her way in the upcoming battle. The scroll shows Blade, Frank Drake, Hannibal King, Ghost Rider, Johnny Blaze, Morbius, Victoria Montesi, Louise Hastings, and Sam Buchanan. Realizing that Strange is already working against her, Lilith thanks Meat Market for the revelation and then decides to execute a devious plan of her own. Meanwhile, Blade, Frank, and Hannibal reunite at their old office, which is in tatters. They drink, pull each other's legs, and generally catch up on each other's lives. But this is when a very attractive woman walks into the office. Little do our heroes know that this is Lilith in her human form. She asks for their help, but Blade and Frank are instantly wary of her. Blade senses a lot of evil coming from her. As for Frank, he knows she resembles the woman in his vision. They both express their concerns but decide to hear her out anyway. Lilith in her human form tells them that this is about her husband. He is in a catatonic state, and those responsible for it are demons, Ghost Rider and Johnny Blaze, to be precise. This piques Frank's interest. His wife is in the same state as her husband. Maybe taking out these demons will fix her too? The 3 of them then head to the Granary burial ground and discuss what they know about Ghost Ghost Rider and Johnny Blaze. The two of them used to be the same entity. Johnny was possessed by the spirit of vengeance, so what has changed? The three of them then go their separate ways to prepare for their confrontation. Hannibal realizes his new powers that allow him total and absolute command over the vermin of the city. Frank Drake grabs his necrotech gun, which he has lovingly named Linda. As for Blade, he ends up grabbing his iconic katana. Ghost Rider and Johnny meanwhile reach their office only to find a location pinned to the front door. Blade, Frank, and Hannibal have invited them to the Old North Church, and Johnny comments that this doesn't bode well. This is when Marlene, Frank's wife, comes back to consciousness, and we learn that this was done by Dr. Strange to set all of this in motion. Meanwhile, at the church, the Night Stalkers prepare for an ambush, and Johnny and Ghost Rider slowly ride in while checking their surroundings. Nobody, however, notices the invisible misty form of Meat Market, a new gift bestowed upon him by Lilith. Then, when the Night Stalkers are in position, the ambush begins. Hannibal lights a flare, Blade leaps down from a rooftop and attacks Ghost Rider, which catches the spirit of vengeance off guard. Hannibal attacks Johnny Blaze in his mist form, while Blade narrowly avoids Ghost Rider's penance stare by reflecting it back at him using his katana. The rider reels back in pain, and Frank then blasts him away using Linda. The necrotech plasma from the gun fuses Ghost Rider's bones together, leaving him immobile. Johnny manages to escape Hannibal's clutches by crashing his bike into a door. He then fires his Hellfire shotgun at Frank, and Blade is forced to save his ally. Blade then counters the Hellfire shotgun with a gun of his own that shoots wooden stakes. The two of them are dragged into position so that Blade can decapitate them, but before he can bring down his sword, he spots Meat Market and quickly shows his friends what he has discovered. They all attack Meat Market, which makes his invisibility go away, and this begins a new battle, one which brings the revelation that the three of them were tricked into killing Ghost Rider and Johnny. Meat Market leaps for Johnny's Hellfire shotgun, but this is when Hannibal King summons his plague of rats to distract the Lilin. They begin eating at his flesh, and while he is distracted, Blade steps in and decapitates Meat Market. Meanwhile, at a nearby rooftop, Lilith goads Dr. Strange to join the battle. He could finish this instantly with his superior powers, but Strange knows better. This is exactly what Lilith wants, for it would tear open the veil between the two realms. Blade then tosses Meat Market's head onto the rooftop to signal that the battle is over, and Strange tells a taken-aback Lilith that this is just the beginning. The Night Stalkers then begrudgingly join forces with Ghost Rider and Johnny Blaze, and together they form the new Night Stalkers. And then comes the day of the fated confrontation with Lilith and her Lilin. Dan Ketch, Ghost Rider's current host, is in a tough spot. His soul walks where not even the dead dare tread. He teeters on the fine balance between order and chaos. He navigates the borders of dreams and nightmares. Images of his past haunt him every second, and visions of what is to come try to stop him in his tracks every step of the way. Meanwhile, high above the Boston skyline, Lilith, the ancient mother of demons, cradles dead Meat Market's body and mourns his loss. She then decides that it's time for a different tactic. So she summons her loyal Lilin, Pilgrim, and orders him to open a portal so that they can go back to the land where she was resurrected, the land of the Midnight Sun, Greenland. Pilgrim does as he's told, and Lilith and her Lilin transport themselves thousands of miles away. Meanwhile, Ghost Rider is leading Johnny Blaze on a wild goose chase. They are searching for Dr. Strange because for some reason, Ghost Rider believes he is the only one who could save Dan Ketch's soul. Ghost Rider also states that Dr. Strange will be able to help them decipher the vision he had while using his penance stare, and this is when Johnny comments that the Ghost Rider seems to be quite sure about Strange. The spirit of vengeance tells him that something in his gut tells him that Strange is the key to all the answers they seek. Then, suddenly, a random portal appears in front of them, and Ghost Rider's gut feeling gets stronger. He knows that they're supposed to go through this, and before Johnny can convince him otherwise, Ghost Rider is already gone. Johnny comments how this portal looks like the one Pilgrim creates, but he has no choice now but to follow Ghost Rider. Lilith and her Lilin meanwhile arrive at the place of her resurrection. The land is covered in snow, and the sun shines brightly in the night sky. Blackout instantly begins to complain about the pain, but Lilith assures him that his pale skin still has enough power to resist permanent damage from the sun. Lilith then begins to carry out a ritual that will use her own prison as the focus. You see, long ago, an Atlantean sorceress used her powers and the carcass of a Leviathan to seal Lilith away. Now she is going to use the same corpse, her prison of thousands of years, to bring back her children and wreak havoc on Earth. Victoria Montesi and Sam Buchanan meanwhile meanwhile catch a taxi from Manhattan so they can go to LaGuardia Airport. But this is when something peculiar happens. The taxi they hail already had a passenger, but when the driver turns around to collect the fare, the mysterious passenger simply vanishes into thin air along with Victoria and Sam. Meanwhile, back in Greenland, Lilith has now created a new abomination by combining the corpse of the deceased meat market with the corpses of 2 scientists she had recently killed. She then lifts the corpse into the air using her powers and begins the ritual. And as the ritual begins, Dan Ketch's soul finds itself being pushed around by unknown forces. His soul then spots a light in the distance, and against his own advice, Dan decides to go toward the light. Simultaneously, back in Boston, Blade, Hannibal, and Frank return to their office. Something's definitely wrong. Their office doesn't look the same, and evil energy seems to hang in the air. The 3 of them arm themselves, prepare for the worst, and then throw the door open, only to be engulfed by a huge magical explosion. When the flames die down, the Night Stalkers are nowhere to be seen. Meanwhile, in Lower Manhattan, Doctor Strange confronts Morbius, who has just killed a murderer responsible for the deaths of at least 4 homeless men. Doctor Strange asks for his help, and Morbius readily agrees. And so Doctor Strange summons a portal and sends Morbius away. And thus, with every chess piece now in place, Strange's plan comes to fruition in the form of his 9 chosen warriors, as they simultaneously appear in Greenland alongside each other. By now, Lilith's ritual is fully underway. The corpse of the ancient Leviathan hangs in the air, and seeing that Lilith is about to open an interdimensional portal, they all rush into the battle. And thus, Lilith is forced to take some drastic measures. She might still be weak from her resurrection, but she has a way to bring her children back. With the Leviathan corpse in the air, she turns her gaze to Pilgrim, who already knows what needs to be done. It had been foretold. He uses his sharp fingernail to pierce Lilith's skin under her chin, and then slowly rips her flesh open. This creates a rift which will now allow her children, the Lilin, to be reborn. And this is when Dan's soul begins to be ripped apart. Instantly, he rushes towards the light that he had seen earlier, and this is when Lilith's hand appears in the dimension and offers help to him. She tells him that she is the only one who can save him now, and that he can call her Mother. Dan grabs Lilith's hand, and he is then pulled through the portal before his soul is finally ripped apart. This is when Lilith lays her eyes on the approaching heroes, and she laughs and mocks Strange, for these pathetic 9 humans with puny powers are all he could muster to face her and her Lilin. Her children begin the battle, and Ghost Rider is the first one to face them. Frank and Blade are the next ones to jump in, and this is when Louise reminds them to focus on the rift and not the fight. The rift is what they need to close. That is their priority. But Ghost Rider knows something more sinister is going on here. He can feel Dan's soul. It's in danger, and he is absolutely right, for in this moment, Lilith is molding it anew and pouring it into the mangled body of Meat Market, which has been fused with what remains of the 2 scientists. But unfortunately, Ghost Rider is too late, and by the time he reaches Lilith, Dan's soul has already been poured into Meat Market's body, which has resurrected him as one of the Lilin. Meat Market is now Ghost Rider's other half and a formidable foe, and unknowingly, Dan's soul now serves Lilith. Johnny rushes to Ghost Rider's aid, but when he realizes that it is Dan's soul that embodies Meat Market's body, he hesitates, which gives Meat Market enough of an opening to smack him away. Sam, meanwhile, calls it a day. This situation has gotten too dire and too dangerous for Victoria. He decides to get her out of here, but she declines the offer and tells him that she is going to see this through. The heroes then regroup and form a strategy, but before they can execute it, Blade jumps into action and begins slicing at the new Meat Market, who is now possessed and powered by Dan Ketch's soul. The creature manages to avoid significant blows and then grabs Blade and throws him back at Hannibal. This is when Pilgrim warns Lilith that the new Meat Market is out of control, for he is tearing through the Lilin to get to his enemies. But then the unthinkable happens. The creature forces Pilgrim to tear open a new rift in his own abdomen. But then Ghost Rider ambushes the new Meat Market and restrains him using his chains. But there's a new problem with this scenario now. What are they going to do with the creature? They can't just kill him. Dan's soul is tied to his existence. Johnny Blaze then comes up with the idea to throw Dan back on the other side through the portal that was just created through Pilgrim's abdomen. Ghost Rider follows through with the plan, and this is when Lilith sicks her children on Ghost Rider. Her Lilin restrain him, and she then declares that she might not be as powerful as she needs to be, but she is more than enough to handle them all. But this is when our heroes jump into action. Morbius tries to attack Lilith, and she sicks Fang on him, only for Fang to then be bitten by Morbius. And this is when our heroes expedite Lilith's retreat. Blade attacks Blackout while Drake aims Linda at the rift. This is when Ghost Rider ambushes Lilith, holds her high above his head, and throws her back into her own rift. The portal instantly closes and takes the Lilin along with it. The Night Stalkers, however, aren't done. Their temporary allies now become their new targets, Morbius and Ghost Rider. But this is when Doctor Strange intervenes and teleports the Night Stalkers and the Darkhold Redeemers away. He then reveals himself and explains to the others why he couldn't intervene in this conflict. But contrary to what he and the others assume, Lilith isn't done yet. She is still on Earth, and though greatly weakened, she isn't about to give up anytime soon. To regain some of her power, Lilith decides to indulge in who she truly is. The Mother of Demons ends up attacking one of her own. Loyal Nakota is her latest victim, and she feasts on her blood to regain her powers. Blade then ended up reconnecting with his love, Saffron, after having rescued her from the cult of Darkholders. But this entire ordeal had caused Saffron to reach her limits. The two of them unfortunately ended up growing apart after this incident. Then another chapter in Blade's life saw him getting transformed into a dark version of himself, colloquially named Switchblade. This happened when a page from the Darkhold was used on him, and as Switchblade, Blade attacked a number of supernatural entities and stole all their powers. In the comics, this arc was termed the Midnight Massacre. Hannibal King and the other Night Stalkers finally put an end to his rampage by using another page of the Darkhold to restore things back to normal. The Night Stalkers would then go on to fight many battles against enemies from Hydra's Department of Occult Affairs. And then, eventually, Doctor Strange's Montesi formula, which had been keeping vampires in general at bay, finally began to wear off. Remember Domini, the last bride Dracula took before his eventual demise? Well, she's had a son, Dracula's son, and she has named him Janus. However, that's not the only blast from Blade's past. Another former ally has also returned, Taj Natal, who used to be Rachel Van Helsing's bodyguard. Sadly, he is now a vampire and one of the conspirators involved in the kidnapping of 5-year-old Janus. The worst part? Blade now finds himself staring at what remains of the exploded jumbo jet that might have housed Janus. But that's not all. Blade can feel his senses tingling. Something bad is on its way, something inhuman and undead. It's not supposed to end like this. People dying, the Night Stalkers disbanded, and despite all the work and sacrifices, vampires let loose on the world once again. Taj then begins to attack Blade, who desperately tries to dodge every attack and tries to appeal to Taj's humanity. But Taj has been turned into a horrible vampire. His form no longer resembles a human, and as they continue to fight, Blade soon figures out that Taj is not in control of his body. He has been hypnotized by whoever has unleashed this evil on the world. This is when 2 policemen show up and begin firing at them. Realizing that he has no choice but to give up, Blade goes limp and Taj flies away with his limp body. Blade hasn't been knocked out though. It is all a ploy to find out who is controlling and pulling all the strings. Taj flies him east for an hour. He then lands outside an abandoned home where Blade finally discovers that it is Verne, the first ever vampire who has now come back and has begun his own machinations. Verne is the one who controls Taj, and he is back because of the weakening of the Montesi formula. Meanwhile, we are introduced to yet another being who is to be a part of what is to come, Bloodstorm, a hybrid created by Hydra's Department of Occult Affairs, using clones from the DNA taken from Dracula. Bloodstorm's mind is blank. Having been created not long ago, he struggles to make the right choices, and so when Verne summons him, he flies off to his master. This entire event is being observed by Salome, who claims herself to be the new Sorcerer Supreme in the absence of Doctor Strange. She then turns her gaze toward Hannibal King and Frank Drake, who are following the Bloodstorm. After all, he now possesses Frank's best necrotech gun, the Exorcist, the only weapon on Earth powerful enough to stand a chance against Verne. They get in the car and follow Bloodstorm and discuss what they're going to do once this is over. This is when we learn that Hannibal has grown tired of hunting vampires, while Frank's obsession with hunting vampires is at an all-time high. Meanwhile, we also learn that Domini is staying at Blade's apartment. She is the reason why Blade is out to find Janus. He is doing her a favor, and Domini feels that she and Blade are quite alike. Meanwhile, at Verne's lair, Blade pretends to be catatonic. He has let Taj take away his dagger so that that he can finally find out who his master is. And then Verne introduces himself to Blade, tells Blade that he can be one of his soldiers when they rule the world, and then mentions Dracula and how he has been itching to exact revenge on the one who dared rule the world in his stead. Blade stammers and tells Verne that Dracula's dead, and this amuses Verne. He wants to know what other delusions plague Blade's mind. But Blade doubles down, punches Verne, and then runs off into a nearby room. He is looking for a way out so that he can go get some backup. But when he finds none and finds himself cornered, he grabs a crowbar and decides to fight Verne on his own. However, this is when Taj smashes through the wall behind him and tackles Blade to the ground. Verne then continues his interrogation, and Blade claims that Dracula perished when the Montesi formula was unleashed. But Verne simply smirks and tells Blade that there are things he doesn't understand. Then Bloodstorm comes in through the front door, and this is when Verne reveals that he kidnapped Janus because he is a bargaining chip. However, thankfully, the kid isn't here because the very next second, with a huge explosion, Salome appears with a special proposition for Verne. She tells him that he can continue to do as he wishes, for the fear he spreads powers her as well. All she asks in exchange is for Verne to always remember that she will be his one true master. Verne, of course, slaps away the proposition by sicking Bloodstorm on her, which forces Salome to put up a display of her power to remind Verne who controls the situation here. Then, to exact revenge, she opens a portal and summons Hannibal King and Frank Drake to even the odds. Because whether Verne survives this confrontation or not was of no concern to her. This is when they notice Blade being subdued by Taj, as well as what it means for Earth if Salome is the new Sorcerer Supreme. King is the one who is quick on his feet. He transforms into his vampire form and then attacks Bloodstorm before he can aim the Exorcist at Frank Drake. Frank rushes to rescue Blade, only then to be thwacked away by Taj, but coincidentally this lands him near the Exorcist, which Hannibal has managed to knock out of Bloodstorm's hands. Blade is now forced to pull the trigger, forced to kill Taj with one of his daggers, but before he does so, he manages to reach Taj's humanity, who in his last moments not only seems to recognize Blade, but also Frank Drake, his former ally. This is when Frank aims the Exorcist at Verne and pulls the trigger. The energy from it does damage the ancient vampire, but it doesn't kill him, and even Verne is surprised. He had expected the Exorcist to be a bit more powerful. Realizing this, Frank asks Blade to run the cables from the gun to their car's battery, and while that happens, we see Hannibal King struggling to maintain his own will around Verne. Frank decides it's now or never, especially with Bloodstorm about to join the fight. He overclocks the Exorcist and pushes Blade away before firing the next shot. The entire place is destroyed, and when Blade returns to the debris, he can't find either of his allies anywhere. Blade warns his allies, and a few days later we see him and the others, including Frank's wife, attending a funeral service for them. Blade remarks how Doctor Strange couldn't be bothered to show up even today, but Doctor Strange is here, just not in his physical form. In his astral form, Doctor Strange remarks how Blade is right to curse him, but how the Night Stalkers needed to be manipulated to work together in order to save the day. Our heroes assume that their allies are dead, and so is Verne, but that will not be the case for long. The loss of his allies only strengthened Blade's resolve. The rise of the Daywalker. Blade would now feel more alone than ever, for now he was the last among the already few, the last vampire hunter. The vampires come for him each night, and each night Blade fights them off with ease, adding to his reputation. He has become sort of a legend now, and he is right now in New Orleans, having heard of a cabal of vampires operating in the city. One of the undead who attacks him tonight is captured by him, and this is when a blast from the past stabs Blade in the chest. This cabal, this horde of the undead, answers to his longtime foe, and the murderer of his mother, Deacon Frost. Blade then ends the vampire's life and then goes out into the streets to find some answers. For New Orleans is home to the famed Brother Voodoo, Jericho Drum, and Blade catches up to him tonight to ask for some help and information. But this is when he learns that Frost's fingers run deep in the city. He has partnered with the voodoo sorceress Marie Laveau to run a huge network of organized crime out of the city, and though Drum would love to help him, he has his hands full considering all that is going on in the city. Blade then goes out on his own, is attacked by Frost's vampires again, and this is when an old ally catches up to him. Hannibal King. King managed to survive the blast that killed Verne thanks to his vampirism. He used his body to save Frank Drake, who is now in the hospital recovering. The doctors have been able to save his body, but as for Drake's mind, well, it seems to have been lost somewhere. Blade tells King about Frost and his presence in the city, only to learn that King already knows about him. In fact, he was hired by Saffron Calder, Blade's estranged lover, who now works as an assistant for Donna Garth, a prolific factory owner of the city. Blade is left speechless as he learns about Saffron, and King goes on to tell him that Donna is being blackmailed by Frost and his gang, which prompted Saffron to ask for his help. The two of them join forces, but before they go after Frost, Blade decides to go meet Saffron. Though he is manhandled by Garth's security after Frost's recent visit, Saffron manages to find him before he is thrown out. They catch up. Saffron takes him to meet Donna, while on the other side of town, Marie Laveau uses her powers to perform a sacrifice that would imbue Frost's vampires with new powers. Brother Voodoo tries to stop her, but the deed is already done, and her new allies quickly attack and subdue him. Blade and King, meanwhile, are tracking down two men of the only rival gang opposing Frost to discover that they too are vampires. A mob war has been going on in New Orleans, one in which both sides are armed with the undead. They have no choice but to watch and wait as the two gangs fight each other, with many civilians caught in the crossfire. King is unable to watch the massacre, for once again he has come to loathe what he is, a vampire, and he has vowed not to use any of his powers again to regain his humanity. Once it's over, the two of them follow Frost's remaining survivors and watch in surprise as they walk aboard a boat, which is their safe house. This shouldn't be possible. Vampires aren't supposed to be able to cross running water, yet here we are. But knowing that they can cross and walk onto the boat means that Hannibal should be able to do the same too. King approaches the docks with caution, but Blade is right. He is able to cross the water and walk onto the boat, albeit the feeling of unease unsettles King beyond measure. This is when the two of them are ambushed, and it is revealed that this was all a ploy by Frost to capture his two fated foes. He calls the two of them sons, for he is the one who turned Hannibal into a vampire, and he made Blade who he is by biting his mother during childbirth. Blade is restrained by a number of vampires while King is trapped under a net that is riddled with garlic bulbs. Blade is bound in chains as Frost mocks them and declares that he is soon going to rule the world. His plan is already started, and New Orleans is just the first of many cities that are going to be ruled by his gang. Blade is then knocked out, dragged away, and when he wakes up, he finds himself nailed to the wall beside Brother Jericho, who has been subdued by Marie using an occult ritual. The bag around his neck prevents him from using his powers, which is why their only hope for now is Hannibal King. King, however, finds himself powerless, and his refusal to use his vampiric powers only makes it more difficult for him to escape. Frost then leaves the boat to blackmail Donna for the final time. He calls her from her own mansion and tells her that she has an hour to sign over Garth Industries to him. If she doesn't, he will kill her before the sun rises over the horizon. Donna tries to call his bluff. Frost can't enter her home uninvited. However, this is when Frost reveals to her that he is already inside. Saffron is beside her, and she quickly arms herself with a gun, preparing for the worst. Blade taunts and chides Hannibal over and over again over his choices, but when it's clear that King won't go the extra mile, Blade forces his own arm through the nail, piercing it, and pulls out a small knife from his sleeve, which he uses to slice a bit of the net that has captured King. Hannibal finally gives in, turns into his mist form, and then removes the bag from around Brother Voodoo's neck. Drum begins to fight off the vampires, keeping an eye on them, and this is when Hannibal turns back into his human form and frees Blade. But then, for good measure, he punches Blade to remind him what he made him do. And then they leave Drum to face off against Marie while they both go below decks to learn more about Frost's plan. The confrontation between the two voodoo priests ends with a huge explosion that destroys the boat, but thankfully they all manage to survive it by jumping into the water. Back at Donna's mansion, Frost is now face to face with them, and he hypnotizes Saffron and forces her to put the revolver against her own head. This is when King and Blade show up, and Frost forces Saffron to fire the gun at her own lover. Blade avoids the bullet somehow, and he and Frost then begin to trade blows. Frost manhandles Blade for most of the fight, slamming him against walls over and over again, but then Blade manages to get the upper hand when Saffron stabs Frost in the sternum with one of Blade's wooden daggers. Blade then pulls out his silver machete and dismembers Frost by cutting off one of his arms, and this forces the vampire to flee before he meets his end. With Frost gone, King and Blade part ways a few hours later, with King vowing to continue his detective work while Blade vows to hunt down Frost and Dracula. You see, during the confrontation, Frost revealed to them that Dracula has been resurrected, but for now he is operating in the shadows, which unnerves both of them. Next, we find Blade on a stakeout outside Empire State University at dawn. He watches with intent as silently a vampire bounds through the streets, crosses the park with a single leap, and then climbs into the science building. This is the undead Blade has been searching for because he is on the hunt for the rumored Sunwalker formula, a mysterious serum that seemingly allows vampires to walk in the sunlight just like him. Inside the university, the longtime janitor finds Peter dozing off to sleep in one of the classrooms. Peter and Jose have been friends for a long time. He often finds Parker studying into the early morning hours, but this time he can't help but remind Peter that rest is quite important as well. Peter smiles and tells Jose that he will keep a close eye on his sleep schedule, and the janitor then heads off to clean the rest of the rooms. However, the next room Jose enters is the science lab. Coincidentally, this is where he comes across the vampire we saw before. He is injecting himself with a serum, and he chides Jose for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and then he attacks the janitor. Jose's screams are heard by Peter, and he rushes to his old friend's aid instantly. On his way there, Peter does a front flip and changes into his Spider-Man costume. But by the time he reaches the science lab, Jose has already perished, and he finds the vampire towering over his lifeless body. Peter instantly attacks the man, but the pale vampire grabs him by the throat and chucks him away. The vampire then tries to escape with Spider-Man hot on his heels. He jumps out of the building and Blade is about to leap on him, but this is when Peter kicks the vampire in the back. The two of them then begin to trade blows, and Blade decides that it's best to jump in once Spider-Man has tired out his victim. But Peter does him one better. He punches the vampire, kicks him in the face, and while he is knocked out, he webs up the vampire and leaves him hanging from a light pole. Blade is impressed, and he decides to get his hands on this undead in a very different way. We now learn that the vampire is named Henry Sage, and Sage is captured by the police and taken to Rikers Island, where he finds himself in a padded cell with his arms restrained using a straitjacket. Sage bangs on the walls of his cell furiously, and this is when the front door opens and Blade walks in. He is in cahoots with the guards of this place, and after coaxing Sage into complying with his demands, Blade smuggles the man out of prison. At noon, when Sage wakes up, he winces and screams because Blade has staked him in the sand on a beach as a crude experiment. As expected, Sage doesn't burn to a crisp, which means that he is infected with the Sunwalker formula. Blade demands answers, and we switch to Peter, who, alongside Mary Jane, is attending Jose's funeral. He blames himself on the janitor's death, and that night he jumps into action again when he learns that Blade has helped Henry Sage escape from Rikers Island. This, however, is of course wrong, because Blade has taken Sage prisoner and he is currently taking him back to New Orleans. Spider-Man knows Blade operates out of New Orleans, so he hitches a ride of his own on a truck with Louisiana plates. Sage continues to taunt and torment Blade on the ride to New Orleans, and this is when Blade loses it. He tells Sage about his past angrily and how he knows that vampires lose all emotions once they turn. And the scientists helping him research the Sunwalker formula only need his DNA, which means that he doesn't need to keep Sage alive. And surprisingly, this shuts Sage up. He tells Blade that he can relate to the vampire hunter because he hates his kind too. His entire family was murdered by vampires, but because of his prejudice, Blade finds this hard to believe. Spider-Man meanwhile tracks down Blade and Henry Sage to a warehouse in New Orleans using his spider sense. Inside, the scientists studying the vampire tell Blade that unlike the other undead, Sage's body is producing white blood cells, which is likely one of the reasons for his daywalking abilities. They then leave to conduct a few more tests, and this is when Blade forces Sage to reveal his past. Sage apparently was telling the truth. His family was indeed murdered by Dracula himself. When he tried to save them, Dracula bit and infected him, which turned him into a vampire. Blade refuses to believe that Sage still mourns their deaths. Vampires can't feel anything other than the lust for the hunt and the hunger for blood. But Sage tells him otherwise. The death of his family seemingly haunts him each night. This is when Spider-Man swings in through one of the windows and hits Blade in the back. Annoyed, Blade begins fighting back. He tries to tell Spider-Man what they're doing, tries to tell Spider-Man that they need to convince the other vampires that the Sunwalker formula isn't real, but Spider-Man won't listen. But Peter doesn't care. Sage killed Jose and Blade helped the criminal escape, and Spider-Man simply won't stand for it. But this scuffle gives Henry enough time to free himself and escape. Upon realizing that he is no longer in the warehouse, Spider-Man and Blade decide to join forces, and they track him down to a cemetery. On the way there, Blade tells Spider-Man the origin of the Sunwalker formula. This all started with Dr. Theodore Jackson, the Nobel Prize-winning chemist from the 1930s. He was captured and infected by the vampires so that he would be incentivized to find a cure for their condition. On his quest to find a cure, Dr. Jackson discovered the Sunwalker formula, but it couldn't be physically synthesized until recently, thanks to a recent discovery by Professor Gerard Jurwich from ESU. Then their conversation is interrupted by Henry Sage, who himself tells them that he was sent to ESU to experiment with Jackson's formula in order to confirm if the Sunwalker serum works or not. Sage is one of Jackson's first experiments, and when the two of them try to attack him, he turns into mist and continues gloating. Sage tells them that an unfortunate side effect of the Sunwalker formula is the return of his emotions. He now mourns his crimes and regrets his actions, which is why now he wants Blade to end his suffering. Blade refuses, while Peter claims that justice will be served when Henry gives himself up, but Sage has no plans of doing so. When they refuse to honor his wishes, Sage corners and ambushes Spider-Man and threatens to turn him into a vampire if Blade doesn't act fast. Blade chucks his silver knife at Sage and stabs him through the heart, and the undead thanks him as his body perishes on the graves of his family. As they walk off, Blade remarks that the Sunwalker formula might not be that bad after all, if it makes vampires regret and mourn their decisions. Till now, Blade has been solely relying on his superior skills and immunity to vampire bites to hunt the undead, but that would all change when once again he would be in New York, and once again he would join forces with Spider-Man. Peter has been having a tough time. He and MJ were supposed to go on a vacation, but Peter missed his flight, and now she isn't taking his calls. While struggling to keep his hands off the phones, Peter is surprised to get a call from Robbie, who tips him off about a shady meeting in the middle of nowhere. Peter is tasked with getting photos of the meeting, and seeing as he has nothing better to do, Peter takes the job. And so, at night, Peter discovers that the meeting is happening between Jimmy Six and Wilson Fisk, aka Kingpin. The two of them shake hands and exchange a huge trunk. However, as soon as Peter snaps a few pictures of the trunk, his spider sense begins to tingle, but unfortunately before he can react, a man holds a gun to the back of his head. The man informs Fisk and Jimmy Six that they have someone snooping on them, and to Peter's horror, Jimmy seems to recognize his face. Peter punches the man in the gut and makes a break for it, and this is when he runs into Blade, who seems to have been snooping on this meeting as well. Blade doesn't know Peter's secret identity, so he advises the kid to get out of here as soon as possible, but Peter recognizes him, and so when one of Jimmy Six's men points a huge gun at them, Peter tackles Blade to the ground. You see, Jimmy Six's men don't have access to normal weapons. They have access to energy weapons, and Peter just saved Blade from getting blasted by a particle beam. However, the resulting explosion instantly knocks them out, and when they wake up, they are face to face with two troopers who have thankfully called EMS, but they have some important questions to ask. Because Peter is in his civilian clothes, he is forced to comply with them, but Blade has no obligation to them. In fact, he has no obligation to the law. And so, when the troopers turn around, Blade simply walks away while leaving Peter to answer the troopers' questions. Unfortunately, these people are on Fisk's payroll, who, upon learning Peter's name, forces Jimmy Six to take care of him. Peter goes back to the Daily Bugle, where everyone advises him to stay low. He learns that Eddie has escaped jail, and then he is face to face with Jill Stacy, who reminds him of Gwen before he remembers MJ and tries to call her again. At night, we see Blade at the docks. He has tracked down the large box to this location, where Fisk's men are desperately trying to cut into it. He sneaks his way into the warehouse by knocking out the humans, and this is when Spider-Man joins him, who is supposed to learn that Blade doesn't kill humans. Spider-Man asks him about the box and its contents, but Blade refuses to reveal what's inside. Instead, he keeps on insisting that it is of paramount importance that the box remain locked. And so, just when the men have managed to cut through the last chains, two of them jump into action. Spider-Man starts by webbing everyone up, while Blade tries to reach the man wielding the blowtorch. Unfortunately, Spider-Man's webs get in his way, and that is when, with a loud thunk, the box is open. Everyone stares in horror as both men are pulled into it and killed, and then Morbius jumps out of the box. Morbius isn't his normal self. He looks hideous and and gaunt, and he instantly jumps at Fisk to attack him. Blade jumps in to kill the vampire, but Spider-Man desperately tries to stop him. Morbius is his friend after all, and he isn't a traditional vampire. He has a medical condition which makes him feel the need to drink blood. But Blade doesn't care. However, Spider-Man causes enough of a distraction which allows Morbius to bite Blade on the arm. Fisk then hits Morbius in the head to save his own life, and Spider-Man then webs up Blade so that he can save his friend. Fisk manages to escape the scuffle while our heroes learn that Morbius was tormented and experimented upon in order to turn him into a weapon against hunger, the new breed of vampire haunting the streets. Morbius begs for death and tells Blade to put him out of his misery, but Spider-Man manages to convince them both otherwise. Blade storms off while vowing to end Morbius's life if he kills a human in the future, while Spider-Man reassures him that he will find a cure for his friend. Morbius begins to lose his strength and is about to faint, but before he does so, he warns Spider-Man that hunger is Crown, one of Hydra's creations, and that not only should they be wary of him, but also Senator Stewart Ward. But something happened today that would change Blade forever. You see, an experimented upon Morbius was carrying a modified form of the vampiric curse, which, when mixed with Blade's immunity to vampire bites, resulted in something quite unique. Before this bite, Blade was simply immune to vampire bites, but from now on, Blade will have all the vampiric powers without any disadvantages. Superhuman strength, superhuman senses, inhuman stamina, as well as an accelerated healing factor. Blade is now wading through the swamps of Louisiana hunting for a vampire lair. Blade's strategies have changed. He now hunts them where it hurts. And what better way to destroy an entire clan of vampires than by destroying their hideout, something vampires desperately need. It's where they hide during the day, it's where they recover, and it's where they restrain and contain their victims for 3 days before they become one of the undead. This hideout, this moored boat in the swamp, is the hideout of Aldous Yancey and Wormdigger. Aldous brings an unsuspecting woman to the hideout tonight. She is going to be his daily snack, but this is when Blade attacks and starts off by killing Wormdigger first. Then he infiltrates the hideout, and before Aldous can bite the woman, he throws a dagger and shatters his fangs. Then, after a bit of scuffling and a few dozen daggers, Blade has killed every vampire in the hideout. He then leads the woman out of the boat to safety, and as the sun rises, all evidence of the massacre is turned to ash. That night, Blade watches the news while carrying his wooden daggers when he is visited by a woman named Dominique Levant. She needs his help. Her problems involve vampires, and Blade doesn't need to be asked twice. It was never in his nature to ask too many questions, which is why he fails to notice that Dominique is being awfully vague about her problem. He seems to be smitten with her because he also fails to take notice of a handsome vampire who is on his roof while they are out on the balcony. They continue to talk. Dominique tells Blade her last name, and this is when we learn the name of the vampire stalking them, Eve St. Monroe. Dominique is here to ask for Blade's help because something's wrong with one of her suppliers. Dominique works at a restaurant and she is the resident buyer. One of her suppliers is named Newton Desiree, a prominent man with a small family who has good relations with her and her boss. They have a teenage daughter named Charisma who has just had a child out of wedlock. Nobody knows who the father is, and this is when the strangeness started. The Desirees regularly visit the restaurant, but lately Dominique and her boss Xavier noticed that Charisma has been growing thinner and more gaunt lately. She then learned about a man who started visiting the family lately, pale and gaunt, a man who looks like a skeleton. This man had a huge row with the family in their restaurant one day, and this is when Xavier told her that there was something unnatural about the man and advised her to get help from Blade because she cared about Charisma. Dominique contacted the family before coming to Blade. Newton and his wife Zinnia told her not to be concerned, but as she was leaving, she watched the pale, gaunt man come to their doorstep, the blood on his lips quite visible. Dominique was hiding nearby, and then moments later, Charisma walked out of the house with her baby in a stroller. She tried to talk to the teenager, but it was as if she was in some sort of a daze, hypnotized even. Blade then grabs his katana, tells Dominique about it, and then slashes at the vampire hiding in the trees above them. Eve comes crashing down in pain, but manages to gain his footing and go back up into the trees. The sight of the winged vampire, however, breaks Dominique's reality. So it's all true. Vampires are real. Blade assures her that all will be alright, but then Eve swoops down and cuts open Blade's torso with his huge claws. They battle, but Eve gets the best of Blade. He claws at Blade again, which sends him over the railing, and Blade manages to grab onto it in the nick of time. We are then told about the gaunt man visiting the Desirees. It is none other than Morbius himself. himself. He seems to be trying to help the family. Charisma's mother, Zinnia, is the cousin of the woman he was supposed to marry. Morbius is trying to help them, but the family is quite closed off, especially Newton, who keeps threatening Morbius. As for what is wrong with the family, it is left ambiguous, and like the time Dominique saw Morbius last time, this time too, Charisma leaves the house with her baby when she realizes that Morbius is here. Back at Blade's house, Eve swoops down again to finish the job, but Dominique steps in and hits him with a chair to save Blade. He climbs back up and then slices Eve's ear off with his sword, which finally causes the vampire to flee. Over the next day or two, Dominique and Blade stake out outside the Desiree's house as a couple to prevent anyone from getting suspicious. Blade finds himself falling for Dominique, and he does his best to contain his emotions. Then at night, they watch Charisma leave the house with her baby, and her behavior is quite odd. She begins breastfeeding it as soon as it makes a noise, presumably to keep him quiet. Blade tells Dominique to stay back while he follows her, and this is when he is approached by Cypher Whalen, a detective from the police department, who warns Blade that the police are keeping a close eye on him. The man then leaves while we see Morbius hunting a man named Harvey Kincaid. Harvey is the local heroin supplier, and Morbius has taken him out because he is Charisma's supplier. Heroin is the reason her health has been deteriorating rapidly. When she reaches the location, she has already tightened the straps of her purse on her arm. She is about to take her last dose when she notices Morbius feeding on Kincaid, and this causes her to miss her mark and stab the baby instead. Blade, meanwhile, begins to realize that something's wrong here. He himself didn't know that he was going to be outside the Desiree residence 2 days ago, so how did Cypher manage to track him down? Dominique is the only one who could have snitched on him, and this is when we learn that she has been manipulated by her boss Xavier, who is a vampire himself, and a follower of Ulysses Sojourner, a prime vampire who has been uniting the vampires on all of the East Coast. Xavier's restaurant has become their hideout for weeknights, and we then learn that Eve is one of his vampires who doesn't believe in his cause. We learn that Dominique was manipulated to send Blade after Morbius, who isn't undead. When Blade eventually ends up killing him, guilt will take over, and this will break Blade. Ulysses knows that, and he is counting on Blade's integrity to break the vampire hunter from the inside. Blade and Morbius eventually come face to face as Charisma runs away from both of them. They fight, but eventually Blade will put an end to his plans without harming Dominique or Morbius. Then Blade would have a short stint with S.H.I.E.L.D. when they formed the Silver Eye division at the orders of the president. Silver Eye was an elite covert organization formed to take care of the vampiric threat in America. However, the organization was infiltrated by the vampires early on, and their leader, Darius Venginian, was a vampire himself. The organization would capture Blade, they would brainwash him, and make him think that he was a part of them. Unfortunately, their plans would fail. Blade would escape, and Venginian's true plans would remain unknown. The stint with the Tricks. Remember Tricks? Ancient subspecies of vampires that would feed on their own kind? Well, Blade is about to learn a whole lot more about them. One night, a woman named Susan Vandermeer is stranded in New York when she is ambushed and attacked by vampires. But before they can kill and turn her, a Trick appears and slashes through them like a hot knife through butter. Word of this confrontation reaches Blade, who begins tracking down the new mysterious vampire hunter who hunts so ruthlessly. But Blade is not the only one on the case. The Seven are involved too, the mysterious ancient organization that is dedicated to vampire equilibrium. They only hunt the vampires or the Tricks when either side begins to outweigh the other. They have their eye on Blade, but for now they decide to see how this entire thing plays out. Blade, meanwhile, interviews Susan about the attack, and the information provided by her makes it clear that this ambush was staged. This is when we see mysterious green gas escape from one of the vampires and enter a sleeping old man's body. The Seven show up at this location, and while briefing a new member, we learn about V3s and how Tricks came into existence. The green gas that entered the man's body was stage 1, vapor. Once vapor has entered the body, the victim is as good as dead. Then stage 2 begins. The vapor solidifies and turns into a gutsucker, the second stage creature that ejects tentacles which penetrate every major organ and artery. Then 24 hours later, the gutsucker dissolves, and finally the host is transformed into a Trick. The Seven stop this process by applying a high-voltage current to the host, which forces the gutsucker out of the body. They then use a genetically engineered poison to kill the creature. With the latest gutsucker taken care of, we catch up with Blade as he watches the sun set. Little does he know that the trick from the massacre earlier is hiding in the trees behind him. A cruise ship full of vampires is where Blade's latest lead has taken him. Blade bursts onto the scene and begins killing the vampires. Among them is a female vampire known as Bitsy, who will come into play later. For now, Bitsy hides with Federico Valencia, who orders the Uukog to come in order to take care of Blade. The Uukog are the vampire's elite paramilitary force, and around 20 of them burst onto the scene and catch Blade off guard. Blade realizes that there are too many of them and decides to retreat, and this is when we learn that the trick stalking him at dusk is here too, and he begins culling the vampires as if they are flies. The trick makes quick work of the Uukog, but when Blade confronts him, to his surprise, the creature avoids the confrontation and flees. Meanwhile, we learn that the Seven is led by someone named Mr. Tomothy, who looks like a teenager because he underwent an undisclosed reverse aging process. We then learn more about the trick. His name is Raucus, and he serves their queen, who is named Sela. Raucus had been tasked to protect Blade by her because she plans to take him as her new king. Raucus obviously hates this plan. He should be king, not Blade. But Sela is playing for something bigger, trying to fulfill a prophecy long told among their kind. As for Blade, well, he is busy getting new weapons from his guy Fofo, when we learned that Blade has stopped using swords because the vampires tricked him into killing his lover, Yathalia. They kidnapped her, tortured her, and then disguised her as a vampire so that Blade would kill her, only to learn later that she was still a human. Then Susan finds herself in the same shop as Blade, and seeing that he is weirdly attracted to her, she ends up inviting him on a date the next day. The Seven, meanwhile, issue an assassination order for Blade. He has been tipping the scales of the vampiric equilibrium, which they cannot let happen. Then we see Blade visiting Yathalia's grave. He has a vision about her in which she gives him and Susan her blessing. Then the vampires kidnap Fofo, Blade's weapon dealer, and take him to Bitsy and Federico. The two of them torture Fofo and bite off his fingers methodically, but they don't let him bleed out. They cauterize his wounds after each bite to prolong his pain. Blade, meanwhile, finds a publishing house run by one of the vampire clans and burns it to a crisp, along with every undead inside. We then head to the two men tasked with assassinating Blade. They are currently at one of the Seven's headquarters, where the senior among them tells his subordinate all about tricks and their queens. This is when we learn what Sela plans to do with Blade. Trick queens take a mate for one night. Once impregnated, they devour their mate, which allows them to produce a new trick queen. This is what Sela has planned for him. We also learn about the existence of a powerful sword that is in the Seven's possession. Centuries ago, a master craftsman created this sword using cutting-edge science and his knowledge of mystical arts. It is one of the few weapons capable of slaying a trick. We then see Blade on his date with Susan, and because he feels guilty, he tells her about Yathalia and how her life ended tragically. After the date, Blade is told about Fofo's kidnapping and how he has now come back, which Blade finds to be quite odd. Apparently, the vampires tried to kill him by locking him in a coffin and throwing it into the river, but they forgot to lock the coffin, which allowed him to escape. Blade finds this too easy. The vampires likely let Fofo flee so they could track Blade. He has his allies set up a perimeter in the hospital while Blade checks the roof. Unfortunately, his suspicions were true, because on the roof he gets ambushed and captured by the Uukog. The two assassins have managed to track down Blade to a desolate building in the middle of nowhere, where the Uukog have brought him, so that he can be tortured by Bitsy and Federico for what he did to their crews earlier. Blade has been stripped of all his clothes and weapons, but when they threaten to torture him and mock his mother, Blade rips his hand out of the nail, punches Federico, grabs his pistol, and quickly kills everyone in the room. Bitsy manages to hide before she can be killed. However, Blade makes quick work of her when she dares try to ambush him. The two assassins, meanwhile, are ambushed and restrained by Raucus, and when Blade shows up, Raucus knocks him out as well. He then drags the two assassins away, and Blade wakes up screaming from a dream in which the spirit of his late lover, Yathalia, condemns his relationship with Susan. Queen Sela, meanwhile, admires her bath, which is called the Waters of Luthra. She then talks to her mother's portrait and reveals that, according to the prophecy, getting impregnated by a Daywalker will bring about the rebirth of Zukaja, the seventh Lord of Dusk. She is then told by one of her servants that Romulus is demanding to see her, and his attitude irks her. He again makes a row over why Blade is the one who gets to be king, and Sela chides him because after their wedding night, Blade is to die. Romulus then shows her the two assassins and the mark of the seven on their bodies, which prompts Sela to demand that they be tortured using the waters of Luthuk. Meanwhile, Blade walks into the Seven's headquarters and Timothy lets him enter without resistance. There, Blade learns how every member of the Seven goes through a reverse aging process once they are recruited, which is why most of their new recruits are above the age of 60. Timothy then makes him an offer that he can't refuse. He asks Blade to enter the Trick Lair to end the Queen's life, and in exchange, he can have the famed Trick Slayer's sword as well as take a bath in the waters of Luthuk, which will allow him to turn into a human again. Because Timothy knows every Daywalker hates himself, and this is Blade's one true desire. And so that night, Blade finds himself mulling over his thoughts and staring at the sword that Timothy gave him. Should he use it? Should he give up his vow and go back to using swords? However, before Blade can decide, the choice is made for him when he gets a frantic call from Susan. The Tricks seem to be stalking her, and while she's on the call, Romulus breaks into her house and kidnaps her. Blade grabs the sword, gets dressed, and heads to her place. Her neighbors point him toward the back alley, where Blade finds a crude invitation to the Trick Lair written for him in blood. Blade jumps down into the hole and tries to tell Timothy that he has found the lair. However, this is when his phone stops working because the Tricks are using a jammer. Blade finds a naked Susan barely conscious, and he begins to carry her out of the lair. This is when they come across the waters of Luthuk, where the two assassins are being tortured. Susan manipulates Blade into saving them, even if it turns him into a human, and Blade finally steps into the water. This is when Susan's voice changes, something Blade fails to notice. She shows him that these waters flow through the corpses of vampires to create a unique concoction, a concoction that creates a powerful sex hormone, which the Trick Queen combines with her own natural pheromones to make herself irresistible to all males regardless of their species. Susan then makes a sultry gesture which crosses the line for Blade, and the two of them head back into the room where they came from and start making love to each other. Blade drops the sword during the deed, which is picked up by Romulus as he finishes. Romulus then reveals himself, mocks Blade, and this is when it is revealed to Blade that Susan was Queen Sela in disguise all along. It was a setup from the beginning. Blade knew that. He knew that Susan's ambush was staged, however, he simply didn't bother looking into it. Queen Sela is now pregnant with Blade's child, and upon realizing this, he asks them if the waters of Luthuk reverse the vampiric curse. They laugh and mock him, telling him that he must have been manipulated. Then Queen Sela tries to finish the job. But upon realizing that he still has his powers, Blade fights back, and when Romulus tries to kill him using his own sword, Blade steps aside and lets Romulus slice off Queen Sela's appendages. Romulus takes the queen away while leaving the guards to take care of Blade. But Blade is angrier than ever, and he makes quick work of the Trick guards. Blade then frees the assassins sent by the Seven, but on their way out, Romulus confronts him. The two of them fight, and Blade eventually gets the upper hand by slicing him in half using the mystical sword. With the lair now destroyed, Blade heads deeper, but unfortunately he is too late. Queen Sela has managed to escape through the emergency hatch, and though Blade gives chase, she is already flying away into the night sky by the time he catches up to her. The Seven meanwhile call off the hit on Blade because the scales have now been tipped. With the Tricks now destroyed, the vampires now exist in huge numbers, and Blade is now free to hunt them down as he pleases. But Blade is now more concerned with Queen Sela, her impregnation, and his child that is to come. What will he do when his child is born? What does all this mean? These questions plague his mind, and Blade decides that some vampire hunting should help put his mind at ease. Blade would then go on to meet the Punisher in a crossover where the two of them hunt down vampires together. He encounters the Punisher on a rooftop when the two of them are overlooking a deal between vampires and humans. The two butt heads. Blade expresses his admiration for the Punisher, and the crossover eventually ends with the two of them killing every vampire and thug in sight. The Hand of Fate. Spider-Man has been infected, and though his condition isn't fatal or permanent, Blade is forced to fight him regardless. Blade fends off Peter, shoots him in the kneecaps, and then knocks him out with a kick. This is when Dracula, the man who infected Spider-Man, reveals himself and attacks Blade. He grabs Blade by the throat and thinks that this battle is going to be easy. But over the past few years, Blade has learned new tricks of his own. He clicks his shoes, which reveals hidden wooden blades in them, and then kicks and stabs Dracula through the heart. He then walks through the school, and when he comes across turned children about to feed on their children, Blade makes quick work of them using his wooden daggers. S.H.I.E.L.D.'s paranormal containment unit, the Howling Commandos, then arrive on the scene to take care of the rest. When Spider-Man is wheeled away, Blade tells them to keep an eye on him. His radioactive blood will fight off the vampiric curse within 24 hours, and he should be back to normal. But then, Blade is distracted by men in full armor wheeling Dracula away. There's something off about this man, and then Blade realizes that these are vampires, and their full armor is supposed to protect them from the sun. He then remembers what Jamal had taught him. You need to identify the threat before it reveals itself, before it knows you're in the room with it. In this moment, the lack of shadows helps Blade identify the vampires. And so on the S.H.I.E.L.D. helicarrier, Pericles 5, while the vampires transport Dracula's corpse, they are attacked by Blade, for if they manage to remove the stake from his heart, he will be resurrected. Blade gets thrown out of a window, which alerts the entire ship, and then Blade finds himself being cornered by at least a few dozen flying vampires. Blade keeps them at bay and then triggers the light explosives that he had planted all over the helicarrier. Blade then grabs his Uzis full of silver bullets, blasts anyone standing in his way, and then parachutes out of the crashing helicarrier. Then, on the other side of the country in the White House, Senator Lucas Cross is informed about Blade's latest escapades and what just happened on the S.H.I.E.L.D. carrier. Cross knows who he is. He is Blade's father, after all. Then Cross heads to Fort Meade in Maryland, the headquarters of the NSA. There he had assigned someone he trusted to decipher an ancient vampiric scroll that he found not long ago. It is supposed to contain a prophecy that concerns his son. The text has been translated and it reads, "A father in chains freed by a son not yet birthed will unlock Vlad's remains upon the salted earth." Meanwhile, Blade is in Latveria talking to Dr. Doom, who tells Blade how he's supposed to go back in time to save his mother from a prison. It is part of a prophecy, part of fate's bigger plan. But naturally, Blade has a hard time believing him. After all, Doom is a crazy dictator. 24 hours earlier, Blade had just finished killing vampires in a circus when he was ambushed by Doombots. This was all a ploy by Doom to get Blade to come to him, and surprisingly, it had worked. Blade flew to Latveria to face Doom, which is where he finds himself now. Doom promises him an elixir that would help fix his bloodlust in exchange for saving his mother, but Doom has to force Blade's hand when he tries to attack him. Doom knows the time has come because the cut on Blade's face is still fresh, and in the past he had the same cut when he saved Doom's mother. And so Doom sends Blade back in time, where he suddenly finds himself in a prison overrun by vampires. Blade slices his way through the first wave and then decides to consult a prisoner who might help him expedite the process. The prisoner informs him that he is looking for Cynthia Von Doom, and in exchange for his freedom, he can lead Blade to her. Blade frees the man, and they find Cynthia fighting back the vampires at the top of the tower. Blade wants to kill her and end Doom's rise to power right here and now, but Cynthia tells him that she foresaw him coming to save her, and she also foresaw how he felt about her. She knows what her son is going to become, but unfortunately that is all part of fate's plan. And if Blade wants to leave this castle alive, then they are going to have to fight together because the vampires significantly outnumber them. Blade hates that Cynthia is right, and the two join forces to fend off the vampires. This is when Cynthia warns him that he is going to regret saving the prisoner who led him to her, because that man is Lucas Cross. Prison has changed him in ways Blade cannot even begin to fathom. Then, before Blade can ask any more questions, Doom brings him back to the present and hands over the elixir like he promised. But there's a catch. Though the elixir will get rid of Blade's bloodlust, it will also take away his thirst for revenge and his incessant need to hunt down the undead. For a moment it seems Blade might not take it, but then the next day when he lands in New York, we see that the elixir is in his bag. Blade would then find himself kidnapped by his own father, Lucas Cross. He would wake up in an empty cell, tied to the wall using a titanium chain, with the hunger for blood eating him from the inside. The presence of his son reminds Lucas of his past, how he had to leave his pregnant wife Tara and force her to flee to London, after the Baron had issued an arrest warrant for him. When they parted ways, he had revealed to her that he was a part of the Order of Tyranna, which is how she managed to get shelter from Madame Vanity in London. Cross would taunt his son, not reveal that he was Blade's father, and knowing about his hunger, he would tempt Blade with a teenage girl. The prophecy that Cross is so obsessed with requires Blade to feed on a virgin's blood, and this is Cross's way of forcing his son's hand. Hours later, Cross visits Blade again, and realizing that he still hasn't fed on the girl, Cross chides Blade and tells him to give in to his desire. Blade threatens to kill him, and this is when Cross tells him that he is Blade's father. Eric, of course, doesn't believe the man. He is white, for crying out loud, and he looks too young to be his father. Cross tells Blade about his past, about his mother, and how he ended up in the brothel cell, and why Madame Vanity kept his true origin hidden. He then reminds Blade of the prophecy and leaves the cell once again, hoping that Blade's hunger gets the better of him. We then see Cross's past and learn that instead of killing him, the Baron had imprisoned him. Meanwhile, in the present, Cross enters his son's cell once again, only to be ambushed by him. Blade cut off his own hand using his teeth to free himself. Eric forces his father to free the girl and then knocks him out. The two then make their escape. Adrenaline helps Blade fight everyone who stands in his way, and as for his hunger, these men are more than enough to satiate him. Blade manages to escort the girl to safety, and this is when we head back to Lucas Cross's past while he was in prison. He was sharing a cell with a murderer, and Cross asked to be killed because he had cancer. He wasn't going to live long enough to serve his sentence or see his wife and son. But this is when the man sharing the cell with him offered him a cure in the form of the vampiric curse, because he was a vampire himself. It is why he was imprisoned in the first place. Lucas's words, however, have put Blade at ease. He needs answers, and so we find him back in London, England. The first thing he does is use his contacts in S.H.I.E.L.D. to find a black market shop that sells weapons. The shop, unfortunately, is run by vampires, led by a man named Silas. Blade shoots and incapacitates most of them. He then breaks off a broom to make a stake, and then stabs the escaping vampire in the heart. It doesn't work the first time, and so Blade uses his stump to jerk the man's chain again, which breaks it. When Blade stabs him in the heart again, he disintegrates. This, however, doesn't go unnoticed. Silas's death sends ripples through the vampire network of the city, and soon a man named Draconis is informed of Blade's presence in the city. Draconis has apparently been searching for Blade, and when he is informed, we see that he was willingly touching a cross and burning his hand. That night, Blade is attaching a stake to his stump to make it more useful when Draconis bursts in through the window, punches Blade, grabs him by the throat, and then throws him out of the third-floor window. Draconis then jumps down after transforming into his true self. As they trade blows, he gets the better of Blade. Blade is surprised. It is as if this vampire knows his every move. He has a counter even before Blade has thrown his punch. This is when Draconis gloats that he has waited for decades for this confrontation. Realizing that the fight is fruitless, Blade runs into a nearby liquor store and grabs the gun behind the counter. But when he fires it at Draconis, he learns that the vampire has insanely fast reflexes because he manages to dodge every bullet. Eventually, the confrontation ends with Blade's defeat when he realizes that stabbing Draconis through the heart with a stake does not work. This is when Draconis reveals that he has been exposing himself to everything that hurts a vampire for decades in order to develop immunity. Draconis then stabs Blade with the same stake through the heart and apparently kills him. Then Blade remembers a vampire warning him about Draconis, how he was being created by his kind to hunt down Blade specifically. Then Blade comes back to life and realizes that the talisman from Silas is what saved his life. It is why he was not able to kill Silas while he was wearing it. We then learn about Draconis' origin. He was a boy heavily involved with the faith when the vampires found him and offered him eternal life in the form of the vampiric curse. Draconis readily took them up on their offer, and from a young age began exposing himself to various weaknesses to develop immunity. But he did not stop there. He then began to feed on his own kind to amplify his power more than any other vampire. Blade learned all of this by hunting vampires all around the city, and now that he knows he is going to need some help, he contacts Hannibal King and asks him to fly down to London. When they meet up, the first thing Hannibal King does is make fun of Blade for being half white. Blade reminds him that it has not been confirmed that Lucas is his father, but Hannibal does not care about that. The snide comments continue. Blade then tells him everything about Draconis, and the two of them decide to ambush the vampire at his celebration party that evening. Blade breaks in through the roof and King throws in a Molotov cocktail after him to get rid of the other vampires. This triggers the sprinklers in the room, and we learn that the water is actively being blessed by a priest so that it can kill the other vampires at the party. Draconis and Blade then begin fighting each other, and Blade eventually reveals the ace up his sleeve when King shows up and blasts Draconis with a shotgun. Sadly, this does not kill the vampire, and realizing that he needs to be rid of the blood of his own kind, Blade grabs Draconis and feeds on his blood. This finally makes him vulnerable, and Blade ends his life by decapitating him. But then, on the other side of the Atlantic, Lucas Cross is woken from his sleep and informed that Blade has finally fed upon the blood of a vampire. The next part of the prophecy is fulfilled, and Lucas's associate knew about this through an ancient artifact called the Sibyl. All that's left now is for Lucas to locate something called the Splinter. Hannibal, meanwhile, is having a fun, relaxing night at Blade's apartment when suddenly we learn that someone outside is stalking him. The man is here for Blade, but because Hannibal is a vampire, he has become the new target. As for Blade, well, he is digging his mother's grave when he is reminded of Madame Vanity's last moments on her deathbed. Blade was by her side. She was his mother for all regards, and he now remembers that Madame Vanity had mentioned that his mother had secrets she was supposed to reveal to him when the time came. But then that opportunity never arose. Blade then opens his mother's coffin and discovers a piece of paper that she is clutching in her hands. Blade reads the note, and we learn that it's a tradition for Latverians to write down their darkest secrets and then be buried with it, to take it to their grave, literally. On the paper, his mother has confessed that her husband is Lucas Cross and that the two of them were part of the Order of Tirana. Blade has heard about the Order before. Madame Vanity helped him get shelter with one of the Order when he was in danger. Unfortunately, the man was killed by vampires before he could have learned more. Blade then contacts Maria Hill, who looks up the Order for him, but unfortunately, the file is classified and only available to the Director of S.H.I.E.L.D. However, the file also cross-references the Knights of the Pendragon, a group that split off from the Order of Tirana a few decades ago and currently operates out of London. She gives Blade a name. A prominent member of the Knights is a man called Union Jack. Blade calls Hannibal and tells him to find Union Jack, only to learn that his ally is currently being attacked by the same man. Jack is dressed in a slick suit made out of spandex, and expectedly, the Union Jack is painted all over it. King fends off his attacker while wishing Blade would get there as soon as possible, while Blade is busy picking up the special package sent by S.H.I.E.L.D. It's a specialized gun for his stub. It can read his muscle movements to do all sorts of things: fire shots, change ammo, and trigger other special functions built into it. It has 3 types of ammo: rubber bullets, normal bullets, and silver bullets, and Blade uses the rubber bullets on Union Jack to subdue him easily. However, Jack ends up falling off the roof when Blade is saving King, which prompts him to use the grapple function of his new gun to save his life. He wants to interrogate Jack after all. They pull him up, ask him about the Order, and to their surprise, Jack tells them that the Order is full of good guys. They've done a lot of good over the years, helped capture the Pope's would-be assassin in 81, brought down the Berlin Wall in 89, and even helped bring down Milosevic's regime in 2000. This leaves Blade speechless, for does this mean his father Lucas Cross is a good guy? They head back to Washington, and Blade forces his way into a meeting of politicians and gets a meeting with his father, Lucas Cross, who quickly leads him to a balcony so that they can talk in private. Blade confronts him about the prophecy, threatens to kill him, but Cross knows he has the upper hand, even if Blade thinks he has discovered the truth. For despite his failure, the prophecy seems to be fulfilling itself, and this is when Blade realizes that it was a mistake to bite and feed on Draconis' blood. Realizing that he won't get any straight answers from Cross, he uses his grapple gun and swings away. This was all a distraction after all. While Blade was with Cross, Hannibal King sneaked into his office and swiped away the paper that held the prophecy he is so obsessed with. A father in chains, freed by a son not yet birthed, will unlock Vlad's remains upon the salted earth. After his vampire urge is sated upon drinking a virgin essence, his resistance now abated upon learning of Father's presence, returning essence lost from those undead in graves at immortal living's cost, the man known as Blade. Blade decides that it's time for them to intervene and stop the prophecy from coming true. They fly to La Crosse, Kansas, to investigate the site where the S.H.I.E.L.D. helicarrier with Dracula's body crashed, and upon questioning the farmer, they learned that there was a man in a green cloak there to investigate the crash before S.H.I.E.L.D. personnel arrived. Blade has heard about this green-cloaked man before. He was the one who turned Spider-Man into a vampire. And so Blade heads to New York and helps Spider-Man apprehend Fracture. This is when we learned from a flashback that Blade saved Uncle Ben and Aunt May from vampires when they were in London for their honeymoon. He then asks Spidey about the man in the green cloak, and Spider-Man tells him that he started following the guy when he spotted him entering a school. This happens simultaneously with Blade following Dracula into the same school. Spider-Man was able to catch up to them first. The green-cloaked guy and Vlad were talking about unearthing some ancient amulet. He interrupted their conversation, tried to ambush the green-cloaked guy, but the guy got the better of him, and he bit Spider-Man and turned him into a vampire. Then Blade intervened, shot Peter in the knees to save his life, and helped put Dracula to rest. This is when Spider-Man reveals that he heard Dracula speak the green-cloaked guy's name. His name was Jamal Afari, and this revelation stuns Blade, for Jamal was his mentor, the man infected by Dracula, which eventually forced Blade to kill him. We then catch up with Blade at his apartment 3 weeks later when when he is suddenly ambushed by his father and a dozen armed men in the middle of the night. He tells Blade that he is going to help him find Jamal Afari, whom he has been searching for all over the world. And so King and Blade find themselves aboard Cross's private jet, which is headed to Transylvania. Cross chides Blade for bringing Hannibal King along, and when things begin to heat up, he reassures his son that he will reunite him with his mentor by the end of the night. He then reminds Blade that he might not like him, but he too is a vampire at the end of the day, which means just like him and Hannibal King, Blade too has no soul. They then reach Dracula's castle, and this is when Cross reveals his true plans. He asks Blade about the amulet he stole from Silas. That is the artifact that Dracula was searching for, and according to the prophecy, if Blade destroys that amulet here in Dracula's castle, it would give every vampire their soul back. One sacrifice is all his father demands as he pulls out a vial containing a splinter of the stake that pierced Dracula's flesh, which is required to complete the ritual. But Blade simply says no, which for some reason seems to affect Hannibal King more than Lucas Cross. This is when a flashback from Blade's time with the 4 vampire hunters, Ogun, Azu, Musenda, and Orige, shows us that it is the lack of souls that makes vampires prone to weaknesses like stakes, sunlight, garlic, and crosses. This is why Blade is refusing to go through with this ritual, and so Cross tries to force Blade's hand once again by revealing that he has captured Jamal Afari and that he would kill his mentor if Blade doesn't comply. Blade tries to get Hannibal to fight by his side, only to learn that his friend has turned on him. After all, Hannibal has been searching for a cure ever since he was turned, and for Blade to deny him what is within his reach is preposterous. The two of them begin to brawl, and upon realizing that Hannibal won't back down, Blade is forced to kill his ally by driving a stake through his heart. Blade then begins fighting off Cross's men, but then he is stabbed in the back with a katana by none other than Dracula himself. Lucas resurrected him. The two of them have been working together to fulfill the prophecy, and he was the one who brought back Jamal from the dead using a spell called Espel Shade. Jamal was supposed to have been more pliable to Dracula's will upon being resurrected, but he underestimated Jamal's will. Dracula then snatches the amulet from Blade, and when Jamal tries to attack him, Dracula swats him away. Blade tries to kill Dracula using the sword he was stabbed with, but Dracula has battled Blade for decades, and by now he is more than familiar with his moves. He easily keeps Blade at bay, destroys the amulet, and then holds Blade up by the throat while his father tries to convince him to fulfill the prophecy. With the amulet now destroyed, all he needs to do is smash the vial with the splinter on the ground. Blade refuses, and so Dracula begins to torture Jamal. Blade tries to stop him, but Lucas steps in between them, and the ensuing scuffle causes Blade to touch the vial, which eventually slips out of his grasp and falls to the ground. Unwillingly, Blade has completed the prophecy, but the vampires don't get their souls back. Lucas feels no different. Instead, Hannibal comes back to life, and this is when they realize that the prophecy foresaw the resurrection of all the vampires that ever existed. Every vampire Blade worked so hard to kill over the years has now come back to life. Lucas naturally is devastated, while Dracula smirks because this had been his plan all along. Blade then lets Dracula fly away to pay off the debt from years ago when he had murdered his 4 companions, and then he abandons his father for life after his crimes would be a better punishment than death. Then a few days later, Blade catches up with Hannibal and gives him the elixir given to him by Doom. It won't give Hannibal his soul back, but it will take away the bloodlust and allow him to lead a more human life. The time with Vanguard. Blade was then recruited to Vanguard, a secret organization of superheroes that was tasked with executing harsh orders, including assassinations on foreign soil. Their first problem would occur with a man named Jafar Yusuf, who had the power to possess anyone's body. He ended up capturing Micromax and forced the Vanguard member to reveal details about their most powerful asset, Colonel America. He would then use his powers to possess Detective Stacy Dolan, and through her, he would murder Trenton Kraft, aka Colonel America. Stacy would then start investigating the murder, and upon learning the truth, it would lead to her own arrest. Then Dominique Fortune, one of the Vanguard, would try to assassinate her, but ultimately fail. Stacy would then reveal the truth to the Vanguard. She would convince them of her innocence and prove how Yusuf had possessed her. The Vanguard would then hunt down Yusuf, and Blade would go on to deal the killing blow. But then everything would go to hell when Colonel America would turn up alive and confront them all. He used his telekinetic powers and control over subatomic particles to survive his own murder and autopsy. But after this entire debacle, he believes that he needs to murder them all to keep the existence of Vanguard a secret. He uses his powers and seemingly wipes the entire team and Stacy off the face of the earth. However, soon it will be revealed that Retcon, a member of the Vanguard, saved their lives by making Colonel America believe that he had finished the job. However, the fact that the powers that be so desperately wanted to keep the existence of the Vanguard a secret means that they are all now forced to go into hiding. Then Blade would come into prominence once again when the United Kingdom would be invaded by the Skrulls. He would join forces with MI-13 to take down more evil forces that would arise to fill in the power gap left by the Skrulls after they were defeated. Blade would then lose the goodwill he had earned when he would try to kill fellow team member and vampire Spitfire. However, love would fix all as the two of them would go on to put their differences aside and pursue a romantic relationship with each other. Then Nightmare would try to conquer the world through his machinations. He would use Blade as his pawn and control him and many other supernatural beings to do his own bidding, and then he would force them to battle Dr. Voodoo. Mutants versus vampires. Blade would then go on to join forces with the X-Men because there was a new threat on the horizon, Xeris, Dracula's son. Blade was fighting back against him because Xeris was looking to unite all the different vampire sects all over the globe. Xeris succeeds, and then we catch up with Wolverine and Colossus as they chase a vampire through the streets, but their attempts to catch him quickly fail despite having been aided by Storm. They follow him into the sewers where they are ambushed by a huge flock of vampires. Thankfully, Blade joins them and they discover that vampires have new tech now, an amulet that can bend sun rays. Blade then tells them about Dracula being dead and having been replaced by his son, Xeris. Back in Utopia, Jubilee continues to struggle with the vampire virus, and the worst part is that she doesn't want to fight back anymore. Xeris, meanwhile, has created a new virus that lures the infected to him. We learn that he plans to unite the vampires and mutants to take over the world, and that part of the plan starts with Jubilee, who has escaped and is now headed to him. Blade, meanwhile, tells the mutants about Xeris' plans and motives. They calibrate Cerebra to detect vampires and learn that Utopia is about to be surrounded by vampires. Cyclops decides that bringing back Dracula is their only hope, a plan that Blade doesn't agree with. As for Jubilee, well, she has found Xeris and she allows him to bite her. They successfully resurrect Dracula and he offers them his services in order to defeat his son. Cyclops would then order the X-Men to battle vampires in San Francisco in order to find out more about their future plans, while Blade and Angel would go on a mission of their own to fight some vampires at a rock and roll concert. Then the fated battle would begin and the X-Men would attack Xeris in his own lair. During the battle, Xeris would come to realize that with his father in play, none of his minions would answer to his call. Dracula would then kill Xeris and decapitate his own son. But now that Xeris is dead, it has left a huge power gap that Dracula decides to fulfill himself. After all, if Xeris was able to unite all the vampire sects, imagine what Dracula could do with mutants under his control as well. He laughs and decides to take over Utopia, but this is when Cyclops threatens him. He tells Dracula that before his resurrection, Dracula's body was being studied by the X-Club. The X-Men know a lot more about him than he would like, and if he decides to attack them, they will use their special weapon. Dracula and Cyclops then have an intense stare down, and though Dracula thinks that Cyclops is bluffing, he decides it's best not to test their patience. He ends his hostilities with the mutants and even allows them to take Jubilee back with them. After returning to Utopia, they quickly isolate Jubilee, and though in Blade's opinion they should end her misery by killing her, this is when Wolverine steps in and angrily confronts Blade, which prompts the Daywalker to part ways from the X-Men. But Emma and Cyclops know better. They're watching all of this unfold from cameras, and Blade's comments do make them wonder if they would be able to cure Jubilee or not. Blade and Mighty Avengers. Spectrum would then head to a specialist shop in New York that sold superhero costumes. There she would be told by the owner to head into the next room where she finds Blade waiting for her. He has sneaked into the city to ask for her help. Then New York City is attacked by Thanos and his forces. Proxima Midnight is the first one to land in the city. Her mere arrival flattens a good chunk of the city, and she then sicks her horde on the city. This prompts every hero in the city to jump into action, including Spectrum. Blade tells her that he can't be seen in America, and so she tells him to put on a superhero costume and join the fight anyway. And so as heroes gather at the impact point, we see Spider-Man, Luke Cage, Spectrum, joined by Blade, dressed in a spider hero costume, armed with a pair of nunchucks. Spider-Man thinks this is outrageous, blasphemy even, but the others simply joke at his expense. Proxima jokes that the Avengers can't be bothered to face her, and Thanos' forces this time, and this is when Luke Cage smirks and jokes that they're the new Avengers. Our heroes would go on to defeat Thanos and his forces, and they would become known as the Mighty Avengers thanks to a trending hashtag popularizing the term. The Mighty Avengers would then go on to use the newly remodeled GAM Theater as their base of operations, and Blade would now adopt Hawkeye's former identity of Ronin. He would then accompany the Mighty Avengers to Atalan, where he would find and recover the talisman of Kamar-Taj, which was being searched for by the Deathwalkers. He would then disappear for a while his teammates fought Lycidas's Hellhound. This, however, paints a huge target on his back, and when the Deathwalkers learned that Ronin was actually Blade, they started off by sending weresnakes to attack him. They wanted the talisman of Kamar-Taj desperately, and when Blade managed to fend off the weresnakes, they started by sending numerous other creatures. Blade would eventually succumb when they sent some were-roosters, and he was then brought before the Deathwalkers. Eager to exact revenge on their old enemy, the Deathwalkers decide that they're going to sacrifice Blade in their ritual. This would prove to be a very dark moment for humanity. When Blade would come back to his senses, he would desperately try to escape captivity. Even the Mighty Avengers would find him and come to his aid. However, by the time they freed Blade, it was already too late. They had managed to drain a portion of his blood, which allowed them to complete the ritual easily. The completion of the ritual caused the Deathwalkers to merge together, and this created an entity called Deathwalker Prime, a large unworldly entity who now had power over all four elements, which also gave it power over the mythical fifth element, the spirit. And so drastic times call for drastic measures, and if Deathwalker Prime plans to end humanity, then the Mighty Avengers are going to do everything within their power to save it. They quickly grab the cup that was used in the ritual by the Deathwalkers. They performed the same ritual on themselves, which merged them all together into Avenger Prime. Luke Cage is the only one who doesn't merge, and he quickly jumps out of the way as the two titans clash. The fight is quite one-sided. Deathwalker Prime is no match for Avenger Prime, and after a few blows, Deathwalker Prime is no more. Kalu then separates the heroes, and they break the ritual cup to ensure that no one can do the same again. An unlikely union. Blade would then go on to join the Avengers at the behest of Black Panther when he introduced a whole lineup of new support staff to aid the new Avengers in their activities. When he would find himself captured by vampires eventually, he would be rescued by the Wasp. Blade has joined forces with the Avengers to put a stop to the civil war going on between the vampires, which is threatening people around the globe. The war is being waged by Shadow Colonel and the Legion of the Unliving. All of this, however, would turn out to be a ploy by Dracula, who now wants to recreate the vampire nation with stronger vampires by letting the weak ones be killed in the Civil War. His alliance with the Avengers would continue, and Blade would go on to save humanity numerous times. First, they would thwart the Dark Council's invasion of Earth. Then when Ghost Rider would be sent to Hell, he would help rescue the Spirit of Vengeance. He would also be there allying with the Avengers when they decided the fate of the new wielder of the Starbrand. They would also go on to stop Khonshu from taking over the world, help stop the Phoenix Force when it came to the planet to find a new host, and help fight other threats like the Hulk and Knull. During the confrontation with Knull, Blade would join forces with Dracula and his vampire nation to take care of the galactic threat. By the way, check out our comprehensive video on the entire Knull saga, which will be linked in the description below. It has it all: symbiote Captain America, the arrival of the Silver Surfer. You won't regret watching it. And so, once Knull was defeated, the world had changed, alignments had shifted, and the Avengers had grown in numbers. Knull was the Dark God, creator of the symbiotes, and his defeat came at a great sacrifice. Once the battle was over, the Avengers competed to determine who was worthy of being the new host of the Phoenix Force, and Echo, aka Maya Lopez, emerged as the victor. But Knull's defeat didn't mean that all was well and good. New threats were lurking in the shadows, threats that had been their allies not even 24 hours ago, threats like Dracula and his vampire nation. And the Avengers are no strangers to such threats. As expected, Steve Rogers is up at 4 a.m. training and preparing for a new day. Marvel Girl is busy training too. She-Hulk is busy studying intergalactic law, while Tony was busy modifying his armor. Thor was busy drinking himself into a stupor. Robbie was busy tuning his car, and Blade Blade, he was busy beating the training program Kill All Vampires over and over again. T'Challa was training and keeping an eye on the world, while the world was busy looking for a scapegoat to take the blame for all the destruction. And then the weight of anticipation comes crashing down when T'Challa is informed of Dracula's latest move. You see, Dracula has been working hard as soon as Knull fell. He fell into the good graces of the Russians, which allowed him and his vampire nation to occupy the Chernobyl exclusion zone. He also had friends in high places, friends who were Americans, which gave him easy access to the Senate. The world always underestimates the things humans will do in exchange for the promise of immortality. And thus, King T'Challa finds himself watching Count Dracula's latest broadcast to the entire world as he negotiates with the United Nations on live television. Count Dracula is cold, calculated, and more importantly, playing the victim. After all, the world doesn't know all the subtle intricacies of their temporary alliance. Count Dracula emphasizes to the world all the sacrifices he and his kind made for them in order to save them from Knull, how the vampires had been mistreated and misunderstood for years, and how they have faced unjust persecution. Dracula goes on to compare the vampires to the mutants and subhumans, tells the world that they have been mistreated similarly and that they deserve better. According to him, the vampires should be treated with sympathy for their immune deficiency, because even after having helped save the Earth from Knull, as soon as the battle was over, they were attacked and hunted down again by none other than Blade. He started culling the vampires as soon as Knull fell, even before the sun had risen in the sky. His face then darkens, his expression changes, because after this speech, Dracula places his demands before the world. He wants freedom for himself and for his people. He wants a nation, a recognized nation, a seat among the world leaders, a promise of unfettered safety, and more. After Dracula's speech, T'Challa heads down to inform Blade of what has just happened. He tells him about Dracula's demands and how, apart from the sovereign nation, the vampires are also demanding a regular supply of blood from the Red Cross, as well as the release of all the vampires they have captured, namely the demonic hellhound from the Legion of the Unliving. Blade, of course, can't be reasoned with. He is livid. He doesn't understand why the world won't see the vampires for who they are. They are blood-sucking monsters. If one fox kills the other, it isn't doing so to save the chickens. It is doing so to have all the chickens for itself. He doesn't care if the Avengers like it or not. He is a vampire hunter, and he will continue to hunt them down, whether the world likes it or not. He then hands in his resignation to make it a bit easier for T'Challa and the Avengers. However, this is when the Black Panther proposes another solution, a solution where Blade gets to do what he likes while Dracula also seemingly gets what he wants. Because Dracula is not the only one who can make demands. As the King of Wakanda, T'Challa can make demands of his own. And so a few days later, Dracula finds the world fulfilling his demands, albeit in their own way. Blood is delivered to them by the gallons, but it's synthetic blood. The vampires don't like it. After all, the hunt was the best part about sucking blood. But Dracula doesn't care. He is going to use the blood to feed the impoverished in his nation in order to improve his standing and show his generosity. Then the vampire nation is visited by the Avengers, and accompanying them is Blade, who holds the reins to the demonic hellhound like Dracula had demanded. His demands are being fulfilled, but Blade is being appointed as the overseer of the vampire nation, and though Dracula tries to fight back, this demand is non-negotiable, because Blade is the new sheriff in town. Vanished. Then one day Blade would find himself waking up in a world where the Avengers never existed. He tried tracking down Robbie Reyes only to learn that the young man knew nothing about the Ghost Rider or the Spirit of Vengeance. Meanwhile, instead of the Avengers, Squadron Supreme is what rules and saves the world from all kinds of threats. The team consists of Hyperion, Nighthawk, Dr. Spectrum, Blur, and Power Princess. We see them facing down all kinds of threats. When Dr. Doom uses the Gem of Sidorak to turn into Dr. Juggernaut to attack the White House, Hyperion thwarts his efforts. Nighthawk meanwhile fights Hydra, led by Black Skull in the Capitol, who has taken all of Congress hostage. Dr. Spectrum meanwhile jumps in to face an aerial threat arriving from space. Tony Stark witnesses this and comments something about stones from space, and we learn that he never became Iron Man in this world because he never took shrapnel to the heart. Having witnessed this, Blade speculates that maybe the existence of the Squadron Supreme is what prevented the formation of the Avengers in this world, when he notices a statue of Captain America in honor of his services. Squadron Supreme continues to fight threats around the world, including Thanos in space. We then see that Blade was in Norway before coming to America. There he met Thor and tried to convince the God of Thunder of his true identity. He reminded Thor that when they met for the first time, he had brought Blade to this same bar for a free drink, told him about his father, his duty towards Earth, and everything he stood for. But this Thor is different. His father is long dead, and he doesn't, nor did he ever, know anything about a hammer. He has become a drunk, and he wants to be left alone, and when Thor angrily expresses this, lightning strikes somewhere outside. Blade tries to tell Thor that this is his doing, proof that he is the god of thunder. But Thor won't believe him, and before Blade can say more, Thor pukes on his shoes, which unceremoniously ends their conversation. Then, in the present, Blade decides to meet Nighthawk, who is supposed to be the smartest man. Maybe he can tell him how he ended up in this world, in this reality where the Avengers don't exist, where everything's alive. But Nighthawk doesn't entertain him, for in this world, Blade is simply a two-bit cutthroat from London, someone Nighthawk is way too familiar with. Blade helps him fight off the Hydra henchmen, but ultimately the two end up butting heads, and Blade is forced to abandon Nighthawk's side. Then we catch up with Blade in the Arctic, but by now he is on Nighthawk's radar, who has now tasked Night Note to enhance global surveillance in order to find Blade. Blade, meanwhile, is here searching for someone important, someone who will find himself out of time in a different world like Blade. He finds a crevice, jumps down into it, while on the other side of the world, when an angry Thor demands more mead, a lightning strike finally hits his drinking horn symbolically. In 1945, the world lost their greatest hero, and because there are no Avengers in this world, they never found him, nor did they bring him back, and seeing as Blade is the only Avenger here, he might as well do the task himself. And so Thor finds Blade's words coming true as his drinking horn turns into Mjolnir, and Blade finds evidence of his old life as he finally finds Captain America trapped in ice. Then we learn that all is not as it seems, and Hyperion isn't as benevolent or as good as the world makes him out to be. He takes care of world-ending threats, sure. He kills Galactus, but he also threatens scientists. His vision is narrow, and his attitude closed-minded. Peter Parker can see through his lies, who is still a reporter at the Daily Bugle. Hyperion then kills Hank Pym, who has turned into Ultron powered by a Pym particle heart. Then we catch up with Hulk at a school. He's trying to talk to the children, trying to tell them that the world has changed. History has changed. However, this is when Hyperion shows up and begins attacking him. He has no patience to hear the Hulk out, nor does he bother to listen to him. He punches the Hulk through the nearby wall, and when the Hulk tries to fight back, Hyperion breaks his arm, and when Hulk grabs him by the throat, Hyperion uses his atomic vision and kills the Hulk. In his last moments, Hulk calls out to Steve, and that day when Hyperion is recharging himself inside the sun, he becomes privy to the fact that a human was just resurrected from the ice in the Arctic. Hyperion then finds himself forcing a homeless man off his school grounds, a homeless man who is neither scared of him nor scared for his well-being. The man shakes his hand, and before Hyperion can arrest him, Blade arrives in his mist form and takes him away. This is Captain America, and he is horrified by what has become of the world while he was trapped in ice. They then join forces and they start assembling the Avengers again, and the first one to join their cause is Echo. They would then manage to stay hidden for a while, and while in hiding they would manage to recruit Black Panther from right under the squadron's noses. Echo would then redouble her efforts and manage to bring Thor on board, who had now recovered his powers and memories. They would then use a Wakandan spaceship to rescue Brandy Selby, Starbrand, from space, and they would then come back to Earth. However, this is when their movements would be caught by Squadron Supreme, and they would step in to investigate this so-called new group of superheroes, the Avengers. They would eventually find the Avengers in Wakanda, and their face-off would eventually end in a violent confrontation. During the confrontation, Blade would first be subdued by Nighthawk. Then when he would get back up again, he would be knocked out by Hyperion. He would eventually come back to his consciousness and help Thor back up on his feet, who had also been knocked out by Hyperion. Then the truth would be discovered. Their reality had been warped by the machinations of this world's president, Phil Coulson. He used the Pandemonium Cube to change the course of history, but when that is destroyed, the truth is revealed. The Avengers return to their former selves, fight off Nighthawk and his assault, and then Blade finds himself returned to Earth 616, and he awoke back in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. In the aftermath of all this, Blade speculated that maybe it was his supernatural nature that protected him from the entire reality warp. Eldritch horrors. Blade's reputation would now precede him, and when the vampires lure an innocent young girl to a party where they plan to feast on her, he would crash into the club using his car, which is armed with UV headlights. He destroys a few vampires in the crash and then pulls out both of his swords to take care of the rest. The girl hides, and when the vampires have been taken care of, Blade rescues the girl. It is then revealed that for some reason the girl is being hunted. She is attacked almost daily, which obviously makes her wary of Blade. She doesn't trust him, and Blade reveals to her that he is here to protect her. Why, you ask? Because a week ago, Tanaka had called upon an old favor from Blade. He had told him about the girl. Her name was Dana Smith, and she was being constantly attacked because she was at the center of something big, something that was about to come. The entire supernatural world could feel it, and Blade would have felt it too had he been a full vampire. Tanaka and the rest have managed to keep her safe for now. They have fended off small attacks, but now a trained assassin is coming for her. They don't know his name, but they know that he is part of a cult and maybe immortal too. The mission is simple. Blade is supposed to protect the girl, find out why she is so important, and then bring her back to Tanaka. And so Blade finds himself with Dana Smith in one of Tanaka's safe houses when suddenly the assassin bursts in through the window. The man is wearing a golden mask, wielding what looks like an ancient powerful sword. The assassin speaks in an unknown language. It seems like he is trying to tell Blade something. But Blade isn't a man of many words. He pulls out his swords and the two of them begin to brawl. The assassin quickly throws Blade aside, uses his mystical powers to light his sword on fire. The fire spreads to Dana as well, and he then swings at her. Blade arrives in the nick of time and stabs the assassin in the foot. He then manages to slice the assassin in the torso, and though the assassin tries to warn him about something, Blade doesn't stop there. As Dana smirks in the background, Blade disarms the assassin and then decapitates him. This death releases a lot of magical energy, and when Blade looks up, he is surprised to see that Dana has now armed herself with the assassin's sword. Black mist then begins to surround her body, and she thanks Blade menacingly for taking care of the only threat in this world that could have harmed her. Well, technically the sword she now possesses. She reveals her name is the Adana, but before she can say more, Blade swings his sword and decapitates her as well. But then the Adana catches her own decapitated head, through which she smiles and chides Blade for being too hasty. Turns out the Adana is an ancient Eldritch god. She is here to destroy the first and second worlds in order to create a new one in her own image, and Tanaka was a mere pawn who helped her manipulate Blade. Blade then tries to attack her again, but this time she uses her powers and hurls hundreds of glass shards at him. Blade succumbs to the injuries and faints, and we then see the Adana walk out and flay herself using the sword. The black mist surrounding her now becomes her skin, and Blade wakes up 13 days later in the Khmer Rouge Cardamom Mountains in the country of Cambodia. This is the headquarters of the cult that had sent the assassin, and they torture Blade for killing their assassin and bringing about the end of the world by freeing the Adana. However, there's a traitor among their midst, a teenager named Rotha, who doesn't like the cult's teachings anymore. They're more focused on torturing Blade, while instead they should be focused on stopping the Adana. When it's clear that the cult has lost its way, Rotha kills the cultist, torturing Blade, frees him, and then decides to defect with him. The two of them would then start their hunt for a new weapon that would have a chance of killing the Adana. Their search would lead them to Japan, and Blade would have to ask for help from his old flame, Tamlin Hamato, or Tulip for short. Tulip is being tortured by a Yakuza assassin when Blade arrives and shoots the man in the head in order to save her. When Blade tells Tulip about his mistake, she scoffs and tells him that she isn't surprised. She is a clairvoyant after all, and the Adana being unleashed on the world would explain her recent dreams. She chides Blade for bringing about the destruction of the world, and Blade tells her to stop teasing him. He knows she's a black market arms dealer who deals in supernatural weapons, and he asks her help in locating a powerful enough weapon that could kill the Adana. The night ends with the two ex-lovers sleeping together, and when the deed is done, Blade tells her about Rotha, and we learn that Blade has left her tied in a remote home to ensure her own safety in Japan. Tulip tells him that she will need to talk to Rotha. She will be able to tell her more about the Adana, which will allow her to assess what kind of supernatural weapon would be required to slay the Adana. Tulip is absent-mindedly getting dressed when suddenly their room is filled with blinding light, and the very next second, a minigun from a helicopter begins firing at them. Blade grabs Tulip and jumps on top of her to save her life. Tulip shows him the secret stash of weapons in the room, and Blade grabs the gun, which releases the vengeance of Shangri. Blade jumps into the helicopter and quickly learns that the weapon releases the essence of a demon, which quickly murders everything in sight. Once Blade has killed everyone, he jumps back into the apartment before the helicopter crashes, and this is when Tulip tells him that an unhappy Yakuza customer is hunting her. What she doesn't tell him is the fact that she swindled him, and the man has every right to be mad with her. Before they can talk more, an explosion sends them flying away, and then 3 men walk in and fill Blade with bullets. This causes Blade to stumble and fall out of the apartment while Tulip fires back at the men. Unfortunately, they then manage to subdue her as well by using a couple of high-tech tasers. Blade lands on top of a car, and when he raises his head, he spots the men taking away an unconscious Tulip in a yellow sports car. Blade chases after them, tries to break in through the windshield by jumping at it in the nick of time, but unfortunately, it doesn't work. Blade then returns to a screaming Ratha sometime later, unties her, and tells her how they're going to have to rescue Tulip before they go after the weapon. Ratha is quite untrusting of him, but because she has little to no choice, she complies with Blade. We then see Tulip being tortured by Lord Dido, the Yakuza leader she swindled. But before he can deal the killing blow, an explosion in the distance distracts them, and their men discover that the sports car has been burnt to a crisp. Then one by one, they all start getting shot in the head with arrows, and we learn that Ratha is the one doing the killing from a nearby tree. Blade shows up to kill Dido, but he uses his powers to snare Blade with his huge purple tongue. Then we catch up with the Adana, who is in Romania. She makes her driver stop the car in the middle of nowhere and then drop her off. The Adana then walks into a clearing and chides the sorcerers for using magic to hide. She is an ancient god after all, she can sense them. They all then appear and try to ambush her. They unleash all their attacks simultaneously, but the Adana simply smirks and then clicks her 2 fingers together, and instantly, their magic is gone. She then chides them for not bringing the Sorcerer Supreme and then clicks her fingers one more time, and all the sorcerers begin to burn from the inside, which eventually ends with their deaths. Blade, meanwhile, makes quick work of Lord Dido by resisting his mind control powers and then stabbing him through the tongue with his knife. The silver metal makes Dido's head explode, and this leaves Tulip now free to help them. That night, as they have dinner, Tulip tells them about Lucifer Morningstar's sword, Lightbringer, which should be powerful enough to kill the Adana. The blade is currently in the possession of a vampire named Hamilton Achilles, who is also in the business of war. To keep himself safe, Hamilton constantly travels in an adamantium train, which also serves as his abode. But this is where Tulip's involvement stops. She refuses to attack the adamantium train with them. Blade and Ratha try to convince her, but then suddenly Blade pulls them both down and flips up the table, as the very next second a dozen arrows get lodged in it. The cultists are here. They have managed to track down Blade and Ratha, and before Blade can attack, he is stabbed in the back with an electric arrow. Blade angrily cuts off the wire, but before the battle can begin, Doctor Strange arrives and subdues everyone. But he isn't here to help Blade. He is here to demand answers and maybe pay Blade back for getting a dozen of his apprentices killed. But then Doctor Strange evens things over with Blade. However, he takes jabs at him and his big-headedness every chance he gets. He helps them learn about Hamilton's train and then tells them that he will help them get on board to get the sword. He is invested in this because he knows about the Adana and that she is a world-ending threat. But more importantly, this is all Blade's fault, and Doctor Strange is going to force him to fix it. And so he opens a portal and Blade is back in his element, slicing vampires in half with the utmost precision. Tulip and Ratha focus on freeing the people Hamilton keeps in cages, while Blade goes off to find the sword. Blade makes quick work of the vampires blocking his way, and when Tulip and Ratha are attacked by vampires, Tulip defends the young teenager. Blade then faces off against Hamilton as soon as he reaches the Lightbringer. Blade quickly breaks the glass and arms himself with Lucifer's sword, and this is when Hamilton laughs and tells Blade that he has been played by the Adana. She predicted that Blade would try and get the Lightbringer, and she let him because the sword contains Lucifer's will, and it will end up changing Blade. This is when Blade realizes that Hamilton serves the Adana. He is getting orders from her in real time. Hamilton kicks Blade, knocks the Lightbringer out of his hands, and then at the orders of the Adana, rips his own head open, which causes him to burst into flames. The sword begins to glow in Blade's hands, and this is when Strange shows up and demands Blade give up the sword, for he has seen the future and neither of them would like what will happen if Blade keeps the Lightbringer. Blade doubles over as he tries to resist Lucifer's will, and this is when Doctor Strange opens a portal, which transports the entire train to the Adana's current location. The Adana is trying to do a ritual that will open doors between the worlds, but this is when Blade, armed with the Lightbringer, shows up to stop her. We then catch up with Blade and Strange after all has been finished and the world has been destroyed. The Adana tricked Blade once again, for she got him to deliver Lucifer's sword to her, which allowed her to complete her ritual. When Tulip tried to stop her, she simply broke her wrist and swatted her away, and when the Adana completed her ritual, a primordial wave was unleashed upon the world, which transformed people around the world into supernatural horrors. The Adana suffered a worse fate, for while the world answers to the Adana as its new queen, Tulip suffers constantly because of the demon she put inside her body. Blade is overcome with guilt and a thirst for revenge, and so he does everything in his power to convince Doctor Strange to teleport him to her. Strange reluctantly sends him through a portal, but the Adana simply laughs at his mere arrival. The world is now hers. She has created her own new hell to rule over it and to send a message to the universe. Earth's transformation is evidence of her endless power. Enraged, Blade leaps at her armed with the Lightbringer, which she graciously tosses to him, but the Adana isn't to be messed with. She flicks her hand and sends Blade flying into a spire. She then traps him using tentacles, tells him that he is powerless and will never be able to defeat her, and then snaps her fingers and flames consume his entire body. Seconds later, Blade is sent back, and then we catch up with a scarred Blade as he leaves Ratha and Tulip in Doctor Strange's care. He then heads back to the Vampire Nation, where he decides to give in to his vampirism and asks Dracula to train him. And so Dracula would train Blade, and after sparring countless times, Dracula finally learns why Blade is inferior, especially to the Adana. His hatred for vampires has caused a mental block. He is not fighting at his true potential, and to fix this, Dracula convinces Blade to feed on his blood. He slices his wrist, fills a chalice, and Blade eventually drinks from it. Suddenly, Blade doubles over, screams, but then when Dracula attacks him, he turns into mist and evades the attack just like the Lord of Darkness. Blade has now become a Strigoi, and he now has the same powers as Dracula because the same blood now runs through his veins. Then Blade is contacted by Bruce Banner, who wants to meet up because all that is happening in the world is making him angry. The two of them would then team up to deal with a demon who had possessed a teenager and taken over a small town along with his kin. Blade would use clever tactics and manipulate the demon into leaving the teenager's body. He would then lure the creature to the outskirts of the town and then unleash the Hulk on the demon and his kin. Hulk would make quick work of the creatures without having to worry about hurting the townsfolk. Then Blade would redouble his efforts against the Adana and her horrors. He would head to Los Angeles to an opulent abode which was home to Satana Hellstrom, daughter of the devil who has grown up in hell. Blade wants to go to hell for some reason, and Satana mocks him at first, but then tells him that going to hell is the easy part. Coming back is going to be the hard part. He's going to need a pure soul, someone he trusts, someone who can be his tether to the realm of the living. And so Blade is reminded of Ratha, who is currently taking care of Tulip back in Japan. Tulip doesn't like being helpless. What she doesn't like more is the fact that Ratha sees Blade as some paternal figure. She confronts Ratha, and at first Ratha denies that she sees Blade this way. She had a father, of course. He was a good man who died while she was a kid. But when Blade arrives and asks for her help, she realizes that she does indeed see Blade as a father, for she could easily refuse him, but for some reason she finds herself inclined to help him. And so they head back to Los Angeles. Satana Hellstrom begins the painful ritual, and after a stint of agonizing moments, Blade finds himself waking up in the circle of desolation in hell. In hell, Blade is tormented by the sight of the circle, and then he is confronted by Abrath the Collector, who confronts Blade on his untimely arrival to hell. Blade angrily tells Abrath that he's here to gather an army that can fight against the Adana, but Abrath doesn't see why the destruction of the living world is his problem. He restrains Blade and begins to rip apart his soul when suddenly Blade is saved by the assassin Blade murdered at the start of this entire saga. He introduces himself as Draven, and Blade apologizes for killing him. It is then revealed that Ratha is Draven's daughter. her, and then Draven is utterly disappointed that Blade failed to stop the Adana and ended up handing the Lightbringer over to her. Blade then asks Draven for help, who agrees to help him in his spirit form, though his time in the world of the living will be limited. Blade smiles in the real world, and the simple act of letting joy into his heart brings him and Draven back into the real world. Now it was time to get the Adana's attention, to do something that would irk her enough to slip up and make a mistake. But first it's time for a little bit of petty revenge. Tanaka is busy coercing a young girl at a shady club when Blade finds him. He reminds Tanaka of his warning to him and then throws him out of the window. Tanaka transforms into his werewolf form to survive the fall, but then gets hit by a car driven by Ratha. Blade then restrains Tanaka and they haul the werewolf away to question him about the Adana. When Tanaka refuses to comply, Draven in his spirit form rips through Tanaka's mind and soul to learn all his secrets. Tulip finds this quite unnerving, especially considering that there's a demon inside her as well. Draven then tells him that he knows how to kill the Adana and then vanishes to save his strength. As for Tanaka, well, the process has turned him into a broken man who no longer has his mind, and so Blade mercifully kills him. Then he meets up with Draven again, who reveals to Blade that they will need to lure out the Adana. She is a creature of pride, and Blade will need to hurt her pride to lure her out into the open. And so Blade heads back to Satana's abode, who reminds him that he isn't even sure that he would win the fight when he manages to lure the Adana out of hiding. Blade jokes that he will cross that bridge when he gets there, and Satana smiles. She then tells him about the archives of the second world, something all supernatural beings hold sacred. She doesn't need to tell him more because on the next page we see Blade slaughtering everyone in the archives. Then, after killing off the last attendant, who was busy gloating, Blade tosses a bomb and walks away, which completely decimates the archives. Meanwhile, Dr. Strange confronts Satana, who tells him that she simply helped Blade when he asked for it, because someone else needs to have faith in him. They both know that the destruction of the archive will invoke the ancient pact of the second world and force the Adana out of hiding. And sure enough, in the second world, minions of the darkness implore the Adana to make Blade answer for his crimes. She doesn't like being manipulated, but she decides to honor ancient traditions anyway. Though before that, she burns the minion who was hounding her because she doesn't like his tone. And so Blade, Draven, Tulip, and Ratha spend days fighting waves of supernatural entities. The world of the supernatural is pissed, and they know that the Adana gets more and more interested in them with every entity they kill. And it seems that this too is part of the Adana's plan, because Blade seems to be losing his soul and becoming more and more like a monster. Tulip and Ratha are worried about him, but Blade doesn't care. Satana shows up and she and Draven warn Blade that the Adana wants to darken his soul, and she is succeeding, but Blade is hell-bent on revenge, and so she opens a portal and sends them to fight the Adana. As they leave, Satana remarks that the Adana can't really be defeated, only her mortal existence can be ended. For as the primordial force of darkness, no one can fathom her true plans. The attacks around the world intensify as our heroes confront the Adana. She is unfazed and she mocks Blade because she has managed to achieve what she set out to do. The world has been destroyed, she has created her new hell, and she has even forced Blade to bend his morals. He has now allied with Dracula, has started using his vampiric powers, and even drank blood just so he would be capable enough to defeat her. Angrily, Blade jumps to attack her, but so does the Adana as well, and when she lands, the ground beneath her cracks, causing everyone to jump back. They start attacking her relentlessly, but no matter the damage done by their weapons, the Adana gets healed the very next second. Blade starts attacking her armed with his swords, and this is when she entertains him by fighting back. They try shooting her in the head, try shooting her eyes out, all to no avail. Then, while the others distract the Adana, Blade transforms into a swarm of bats, attacks the Adana, and then steals the Lightbringer from her. Draven then stabs her in the back with the Lightbringer and destroys her mortal existence in this world. The Adana gloats even as she is being wiped out of existence, and angrily Blade stomps her head to a pulp before she can complete her sentence. But she was right, the world has been changed, and all Blade can now do is find the new horrors and fight them out of existence, one day at a time. At least he has Tulip and Ratha by his side, who after saying goodbye to her father's spirit, finds herself content because now, after finishing the job he set out to do, he is finally at peace. Blade then sits down at the edge of the cliff to stare at the sunset, for he has done more than enough for today, at the least. possessed. The world would then come to fear Blade like never before, for it seems Blade has given in to his evil side and has unleashed hell upon the world. Blade would lead a group of vampires to use the Dark Force and blot out the sun, which would plunge the mortal world into eternal darkness, creating the perfect conditions for vampires. Then he would join forces with the Blood Coven, a group of superpowered vampires, and together they would attack the Avengers. The ensuing battle would lead to the capture of several Avengers, including Black Panther, who would be bitten and turned into a vampire. Blade and his vampires would then attack and seize control of the Impossible City, the orbital headquarters of the Avengers. This would prompt the surviving heroes to adopt rather drastic measures. Doctor Strange in his astral form and Clea would head to Latveria to seek help, while Hunter's Moon and Tigra would go to Asgard. But Blade's machinations were seemingly only just beginning, for he would now translocate the ancient Atlantean temple of the first blasphemy directly to Central Park in New York. And so Doctor Strange and Clea are in Doom's throne room asking for help, and Doom doesn't waste his chance to gloat about his abilities. As for Blade, well, as he walks into the temple of the first blasphemy, Black Panther realizes that this isn't really Blade, this is someone possessing his body, for he claims to have been there when this temple was first built. He confronts the entity, who confirms his suspicions. He tells T'Challa that he is something far greater and older. This houses his eternal plan, one which he had laid out with the temple's creations. This prompts T'Challa to scream and demand a straight answer, and the entity turns around and reveals that he is the first vampire. He is Verne. Doom tells Clea and Doctor Strange the same thing back in Latveria, and then reveals that he has already assembled the best of the Strange Academy to help them. He can help remove the darkness that surrounds the planet. All he needs to do is become the Sorcerer Supreme to finish the job, which causes Doctor Strange to step back. Meanwhile, back at the temple of the first blasphemy, Verne continues to gloat. We learn that he was the one to transcribe the Darkhold all those years back, and it was then he took the first step towards his final mission. And now that the living Darkhold is in his possession, he has the blood of a god and is back in his own temple. The ritual can finally be completed. Because turning into a vampire was only the first step. The vampire was his pupil form. Verne then grabs a bowl of blood from the temple, drinks it, and then turns into his final form as the dark force seeps into his being. He has now become one with the darkness. He now wields it like a weapon, and Verne now has enough power to consume stars. But then a circle of light appears in the sky which twitches and transforms into a triangle, and the fists of Khonshu come pouring out of it, led by the resurrected Moon Knight. T'Challa then tries to stab Verne in the back, but is quickly held back by tentacles sprouting out of Verne's body. He chides T'Challa, but turns out Black Panther was only buying time so that Thor could arrive before Verne made his move. And Thor is not alone. He is joined by the rest of the Avengers. The battle begins, and Verne seems to have the upper hand despite being outnumbered. However, the tide starts to turn when our heroes manage to free the Scarlet Witch, who begins fighting Verne using her mystical powers. Meanwhile, in Latveria, despite Clea's apprehensions, Doctor Strange hands over the title of Sorcerer Supreme to Doctor Doom. Back at the temple, Verne begins to be overwhelmed as Moon Knight and the Fists of Khonshu attack, and this is when Brielle, aka Bloodline, Blade's daughter, catches Verne by surprise and stabs him in the chest. Verne laughs off the wound because he has been possessing Blade for enough time that the body is now his, and Brielle isn't considered his bloodline anymore. However, this is when Miles surprises Verne and stabs him with his bioelectric sword, and this hurts Verne a lot because Miles is technically from his bloodline now. This wound would force Verne's spirit and the Dark Force out of Blade's body, and this is when Scarlet would jump into action. She would exorcise Verne's spirit and trap it inside the Crystal of Chaos Magic. This sudden exchange of power allowed Doctor Doom to reverse the ritual conducted by Verne, which caused the Dark Force to retreat from the sky, and this would finally end the vampire invasion heralded by Verne. Peace. Blade would then go on to make a full recovery, and then he decided he needed a break. A well-deserved break. He would go to a Buddhist temple in Thailand to find peace and tranquility, and there he would be reunited with his old flame, Tulip. She would track him down to the temple, where Blade would tell her that he didn't want to discuss Verne, and she would understand his perspective. The two sit beside each other, and Blade tells her that he would have killed himself before he let Verne touch her. And thus, this is where we leave Blade, at least for now.